Part 30. The Rebirth of Space, the Lucky Girl from a Farm Family. Author, He Would Fire Every. Chapter 291. Chapter 291 Attending a Banquet 2. When the British government's carriage passed by Chang'an Restaurant, shopkeeper Miao was at the door explaining to Lu Tong, who was about to go to the morning market to make purchases. Shopkeeper Miao turned his head and saw the carriages and horses of the British government. He frowned and said, "People from the British government." Lu Tong followed shopkeeper Miao's gaze and saw that the carriage had the mark of the British Duke. He nodded and said, "It's a British Duke's carriage. Why are there so many people?" Shopkeeper Miao walked a few steps to the roadside, then stood on tiptoe and looked at the back of the team, and said dully, "It's so early in the morning, where are they going?" The relationship between the British government and the boss was constantly being cut and messed up, which made shopkeeper Miao have to be vigilant. Lu Tong is a close confidant of shopkeeper Miao, and he is also well aware of the relationship between his boss and the British government. Seeing the opportunity, he said, "Don't worry, shopkeeper, I'll go and inquire." Shopkeeper Miao looked at the team, nodded and said, "Go ahead, take this." As he said that, shopkeeper Miao stuffed a few pieces of broken silver into Lu Tong's hand. Lu Tong understood, walked to the roadside with the silver, and walked forward with the British Duke's team. He looked for an opportunity to inquire about the people around him, asked the reason, and immediately turned around and returned to the entrance of Chang'an Restaurant. Shopkeeper Miao saw Lu Tong coming back and asked anxiously, "How are they? Have you found out? Where are they going so early in the morning?" Lu Tong swallowed his saliva and said, "I found out that they are going to the Qin Prince's mansion for a banquet." "Going to a banquet?" Shopkeeper Miao asked in disbelief. Lu Tong nodded and said, "Yes, the British Duke's servants said that the Prince of Qin's palace sent a message to the British Duke's palace yesterday, inviting them to a banquet." When shopkeeper Miao heard this, he had a rough idea and said to Lu Tong, "This is something that is going to happen to the British Duke's palace again. Don't go to the morning market today. Take a shortcut to the Prince of Qin's palace and tell the British Duke's palace what happened. Tell the people in the palace." Lu Tong received the order and turned around to go to the Prince of Qin's mansion. Shopkeeper Miao returned to the courtyard. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that the British government was causing trouble. How can anyone go to someone's house for a banquet just after dawn? This is obviously to stir up trouble. If you go over so early, you might have to go to Prince Qin's mansion for breakfast, right? When shopkeeper Miao thought of this, he turned around and went to the kitchen, where he asked people to pack the breakfast and put it on the carriage. He also dispatched 2 cooking pots and several helpers and sent them to Prince Qin's mansion. After sending the person away, shopkeeper Miao still felt uneasy, so he called some of the waiters and said, "You guys, hurry to other semicolons and ask each restaurant to send 2 more chefs and 4 assistant cooks to the Prince of Qin's mansion to help." After the waiters were ordered to leave, shopkeeper Miao went back and arranged for people to prepare recipes for the banquet, and then sent people to the market to buy the required ingredients and send them to the Prince of Qin's mansion. At the Prince of Qin's mansion, the concierge received Lu Tong's report and immediately reported the matter to Rugjuan. When Rugjuan came in, King Qin and Ruanchu were having breakfast. "Your Majesty, shopkeeper Miao just asked Lu Tong to deliver a message, saying that people from the British government are coming to the prince's palace for a banquet. Lu Tong took a shortcut, and people from the British government will be here in a quarter of an hour at most." Ruanchu turned to look at the hourglass and asked, "Who's going to the banquet at Mao hour?" The king of Qin sneered, "The old lady is not here for the banquet, she is here to look for me and I am unhappy." Ruanchu frowned, "It's just nonsense. Are the whole Lu family just letting the old lady do whatever she wants?" Rugjuan looked at King Qin and asked, "Your Majesty, what should I do?" King Qin said, "The visitor is a guest. When he comes, he will be welcomed in. Do you know how many people are here? Rugjuan said, it is said that the whole government is here. King Qin nodded, I understand, welcome in. Ruan Chu said, I'm afraid you haven't had breakfast if you come here so early. With so many people coming, it's too late to cook in the kitchen. Can I ask someone to buy some? King Qin said, no, since shopkeeper Miao has seen it, he will make arrangements. Rugjuan will take a few people to the kitchen to have a look and help move things. Rugjuan was ordered to lead people to the big kitchen. The king of Qin said to Ruan Chu, let's continue. Ruan Chu nodded, okay, he picked up his chopsticks and started eating again. The king of Qin ate a plate of crystal buns and a bowl of rice porridge before putting down his chopsticks. Ruan Chu eats quickly, and when King Qin eats well, he also eats well. Taking the tea handed by the chamberlain and washing his mouth, Ruan Chu asked, Your Majesty, what are the arrangements for the female family members of the British government? Ruan Chu grew up in a military camp and was used to getting along with men. Things involving women made him very frightened. If the visitors are just Mrs. Yang and Mrs. Li, they were once Zikin's elders, and the king of Qin can come out to receive them. Now that all the people from the British government are here, including Lu Xiran and Lu Zixun's daughter-in-law, it would be inappropriate for the king of Qin to come out to receive them. King Qin was annoyed, and he forgot about this and said, let Xi Niang receive you. Ruan Chu asked, Xi Niang? Will her status be lowered? The British husband and wife are not easy to deal with. Let Xi Niang receive you, and she will use the topic to cause trouble. King Qin said, there is nothing we can do about it. Let Xi Niang bear it first, and then let someone go to Qingqiu Duke's mansion to report it and ask Grandma and the others to come over early. Lai Shun came in and reported, Your Majesty, people from the British government have arrived. King Qin nodded, got up and walked out and said, Xi and Yang will come with me and help to receive her. Come on, please tell someone to go to the branch of the Duke Qingqiu mansion and ask Grandma and the others to come over early. Ruan Chu followed and walked out, okay, no problem. Okay, I understand. The king of Qin took Ruan Chu to the shadow wall. When he saw Rumen here, he asked, where is the person? Rug leaned back and said, go back to the prince, he has not entered the palace yet. Xi Niang asked me to wait for the prince here. Xi Niang said that the prince has a distinguished status, and to welcome guests here is already a great honor to the British prince's house. King Qin nodded and said, okay, I understand. Where is Rugjuan? Outside the door. Rug Yan replied, yes, Prince Rug Xian is waiting outside the gate to greet you. King Qin asked, did Xi Niang tell me how to arrange the female family members? Rug Jin nodded, back to the prince, Xi Niang asked someone to tell the concierge. The male guests dismounted or got off their horses at the gate and entered through the side door. After the male guests entered the house, the female family member's car entered the house again. The female family member's car drove directly to the second gate. Xi Niang and her people were waiting at the second gate. Seeing that Xi Niang had made all the arrangements, King Qin felt at ease. He put his hands behind his hands and waited for the people from the British government to come in. After a while, Rugjuan led Lu Dingning, Lu Xiran, Lu Zixun, and Lu Zijian in. Lu Dingning saw that King Qin was wearing a snow-white straight-fronted robe, with a wide belt of moon-white auspicious clouds tied around his waist. A piece of black jade with excellent quality was hung on it, and his black hair was tied with a jade crown. In a daze, I felt that the person in front of me was still Lu Lang from the British government, who saw him as respectful and kind. Lu Dingning was so fascinated that he forgot to step forward and salute. Lu Zijian stood behind Lu Xiran and reminded in a low voice, brother, remind my second uncle to come forward and pay respects. After the incident at Green Light, Lu Xiran had no good impression of Lu Dingning as his father. He pretended not to have heard Lu Zijian's reminder. Seeing that Lu Xiran didn't respond, Lu Zijian thought he didn't hear him, so he raised his voice slightly and said, "Brother, remind my second uncle that it's time to come forward and pay respects." Lu Dingning came back to his senses when he heard Lu Zijian's voice, and led a group of people to pay tribute to the king of Qin. The king of Qin returned the courtesy with his hands raised, and then exchanged pleasantries with each other, and then politely allowed everyone to go to the main hall. The car of the female family members of the British government was blocked outside the palace gate, and they had to wait until the men had settled down before they could enter the palace. Mrs. Yang sat in the car for a long time without seeing the car move. She impatiently raised the curtain and looked outside, asking, "What's going on? You stopped at the door for a long time and didn't put it in. What's the meaning of this? This is the way of hospitality in the Qin palace? Who would block the guests at the door when hosting a banquet?" Rugjuan leaned forward and said, "I'm sorry, please don't be impatient. The second master and all of you are here to pay homage to the prince. The second master and the others have not seen the prince for a few days. When they meet, it is inevitable to get closer and talk more quietly. Therefore, everyone was delayed from entering. When the second master and the others follow the prince and go in, our car will go in. Is it inevitable to get closer?" Lu Dingning licked him after seeing Nai Zhan being crowned the king. Mrs. Yang had a picture in her mind of Lu Dingning smiling and flattering her, and her breathing became difficult. She didn't expect her son to be so dissatisfied, so he was pulled back by her. Her chest hurt because of the tightness. When she turned around and saw Rugjuan, she vented her anger on Rugjuan. "Who are you? What qualifications do you have to talk to me? Huh? Are you so rude to the Prince of Qin?" Rugjuan had lived in the British government for many years and knew the old lady's temperament. He was very angry. He took a deep breath to calm down, lowered his hands and stepped aside without saying a word. When Lei Wang saw Rugjuan swallowing his anger, the fire in his heart surged upwards. The old witch who came there was arrogant and disrespectful. She always scolded her and pointed fingers at the people in the Prince of Qin's palace. Lei Wang cleared his throat loudly and said in a sharp voice, "Rugjuan, we can tell you that this person is different from others. You still don't believe it, so you have to argue with us. How about it? Does our family make sense? A person who is well educated and knows etiquette always speaks and acts in a gentle manner. Those who think they are superior to others, who speak aggressively and are bossy, often lack family education and education. Right? How about it? Do you believe it now?" Rugjuan looked up at Lai Wang, wanting him to say less, but saw Lai Wang raising his eyebrows at him, so Rugjuan swallowed back the words that came to his lips. Lai Wang continued, "Actually, many people are just scoundrels. You can't indulge them or coddle them. She is unreasonable, so you have to be even more unreasonable than her. If you coddle such a wicked person, she will think she can go to heaven." Lai Wanghao made some insinuations. How could Mrs. Yang not hear it? Angry, he lifted the curtains to look at Lai Wang and said in a loud voice, "You, come here." Lai Wang turned his head and looked over, immediately changed his face, and asked with a pleasant smile, "Mrs. Yang, do you want to call us home?" Mrs. Yang was stunned by Lai Wang's smile. Her tone softened a lot, and she said, "It's you, stand up here." Not only was Mrs. Yang confused, but Rugjuan's eyes were also wide open. How could a person change his face like this? Lai Wang took 2 steps forward with a smile, bowed respectfully and said, "I wonder what Mrs. Yang's orders are." "What did you say just now? Who are you scolding?" Mrs. Yang asked with a straight face. Lei Wang looked at Mrs. Yang with an innocent face and said, "Back to Mrs. Yang, we didn't say anything." "Oh. Our family is discussing etiquette with Rugjuan. Our family says that cultivating etiquette has little to do with status. Some people think that even though she lives in a wealthy family, in terms of etiquette, she is worse than a white lady from a rural family. Because cultivating etiquette is closely related to family education. The old lady is well informed. Please ask the old lady to judge us and see if what we say is reasonable. Mrs. Yang knew clearly that Lai Wang connoted her, but she couldn't say anything accusatory, and her face turned blue with anger. Fortunately, the concierge came over in time and said, "Manager Xian, you can come in." Rugjuan called to the driver to start the car and go to the house. Lei Wang stepped aside, leaned forward, and said, "Old lady, please." Mrs. Yang's car drove forward for a short distance, and Lai Wang raised his shrill voice again, "Rugjuan, they say that those who come are guests, and those who are guests should act like guests. How can any guest come here? A person coming to the master's door is not capable of such a well-educated person." After hearing what Lai Wang said, Mrs. Yang was so angry that she wanted to lift the curtain and curse. Grandma Wang hurriedly stretched out her hand to pull the curtains, shook her head at Mrs. Yang and said, "Old madam, that person didn't mention his name, so we can't gain anything by going up to argue with him. Forget it, we don't have to argue with the nunnery, just let him be." Mrs. Yang said angrily, "Didn't you hear how unpleasant he said it?" Grandma Wang advised, "The old slave heard it, but, forget it, let's pretend we didn't hear it." As he spoke, the car had already entered Prince Jin's mansion. Old Madame Yang half pushed and complied with Grandma Wang's wishes, leaned back again, and said angrily, "That evil obstacle had better not let me get the chance to talk, otherwise, I will do it one by one. I must give him a good look." Grandma Wang lowered her voice and reminded, "Old lady, be careful what you say. Mr. Lu is now the prince and the eldest son of the emperor. Insulting words are disrespectful and will be punished." Mrs. Yang glanced at Grandma Wang and said angrily, "Why are you so cowardly? There are only two of us in the car, how can you still spread this word?" Grandma Wang laughed and said, "The old lady is really good at joking. How could the old slave do such a thing?" The car stopped, the driver jumped out and put the footstool in place. "Old lady, here we are." The chamberlain standing beside Shi Niang hurriedly stepped forward to open the curtain and asked Mrs. Yang to get out of the car. Another chamberlain sent an umbrella over to protect old man Yang from the rain. Mrs. Yang got out of the car and saw the maids. The waiters were holding umbrellas and were divided into two rows, spaced 3 steps apart, all the way to the corridor. Mrs. Yang was greatly disturbed when she saw the neat and orderly formation. She asked the family to come here early because she wanted to catch the Prince of Qin's palace off guard. She wanted to see the people in the Prince of Qin's palace panic and embarrass themselves. Seeing Mrs. Yang get out of the car, Shi Niang stepped forward and said, "Hello, madam, I am Shi Niang, the steward of Prince Jin's mansion. With the prince's instructions, I am responsible for receiving the female family members who arrive at the mansion today." Mrs. Yang looked at Shi Niang and said coldly, "Lead the way." Shi Niang didn't take old Madame Yang's contempt into consideration. She raised her head and looked at the other female relatives of the British Duke. After the others followed and blessed Mrs. Li, she said, "Old madam, please, second madam. Everyone, please come down." End of this chapter. The Rebirth of Space, the Lucky Girl from a Farm Family. Author, He Would Fire Every. Chapter 292. Chapter 292 Attending a Banquet 3. Mrs. Yang followed Shi Niang for a while. When she turned around, she didn't see the servants following her, so she asked, "Where are the people, why didn't they follow?" Mrs. Li understood what Mrs. Yang was referring to and replied, "It seems that the people from the palace took them to the other side." When Mrs. Yang heard this, she immediately straightened her face. Looking at Mrs. Li's swollen voice, she asked, "It's on the other side. Why didn't you stop it? Where is the other side?" Facing Mrs. Yang's scolding, Mrs. Li felt extremely aggrieved. A guest does as he pleases. When visiting someone else's house, doesn't he always follow the host's arrangements? What does this have to do with her? Why are you yelling at her? It's okay to yell at her at home, but if you yell at her when you're a guest outside, doesn't she want to lose face? Seeing that she did not respond for a long time, Mrs. Yang asked in an even more unkind tone, "Are you mute?" The anger in Mrs. Leer's heart was rising. She clenched the handkerchief tightly with both hands and took several deep breaths before calming down. He raised his hand and pointed to the left side, "Going over there." Mrs. Yang looked along Li's hand, but saw no figure, so she complained, "You saw it, why did you stop it? They are all from the British government, and you are their master, why don't you protect them?" Zhu couldn't stand it anymore, so she defended Li and said, "Grandma." Mrs. Leer was afraid of making noise and making people laugh, so she quickly interrupted Zhu and said, "My mother treats her subordinates with kindness and cares for everyone in the house, so she is respected by everyone in the house. My daughter-in-law keeps her mother's teachings in mind." Ms. Zhu turned her head to look at her mother-in-law, who was still in a low position, and swallowed the words that came to her lips. Shi Niang pretended not to know that Mrs. Yang and others had stopped and continued walking forward. The chamberlain holding an umbrella next to him reminded, "Manager Shi, Mrs. Yang seems to be asking about the whereabouts of the British Duke's servants." Shi Niang stopped and turned to look at Mrs. Yang. Mrs. Yang saw Shi Niang looking over and asked in an unfriendly tone, "Steward Shi, where are the people in our house? Where did you let people take them?" Shi Niang bowed slightly and said calmly, "Go back to the old lady, I will ask someone to take them to Chennai Pavilion." Mrs. Yang had a sullen face and asked fiercely, "Why? Aren't you just a guest? What? There are different courtyards for reception? Are the guests of Prince Jin's residence divided into 3, 6, or 9 grades?" Shi Niang smiled slightly and said, "The old lady is right, the visitors are guests, how can we classify the guests into different grades? Chennai Pavilion is a place used by the Prince of Qin to entertain guests. It is adjacent to Chenming Pavilion and shares the same lobby. It's just that the entrance and exit gates are different. The old lady entered the house from here, walked through the lobby, and arrived at the courtyard of Chennai Pavilion, where she could see people from the British government. The British Duke's palace has been kind to our prince. Madam Yang, please rest assured that the Prince of Qin's palace will never neglect the distinguished guests from the British Duke's palace. The British government officials came so early, so they probably haven't had breakfast yet, right? I ordered the kitchen to prepare breakfast and invited Mrs. Yang to come in for breakfast." Little Mrs. Li clasped her hands in front of her and stood behind Mrs. Li with her head bowed, her expression expressionless. Mrs. Zhu felt so embarrassed and looked at Mrs. Yang with anger in her eyes. Mrs. Yang originally came to the Prince of Qin's mansion to find trouble, so naturally she didn't feel that her words and deeds were excessive. She thought she had used this trick correctly, and felt a little proud in her heart. In Mrs. Yang's view, Shi Niang's words were nothing more than quibbling. She brought all the people here just to embarrass Prince Jin's house. Mrs. Yang snorted coldly. She raised her head and looked at the plaque on the door of the courtyard with suspicion. There were indeed 3 characters Chenming Pavilion written on the plaque. Mrs. Leer tried to smooth things over and said, "It's raining heavily, let's go in quickly." Shi Niang leaned forward and said, "Everyone, please." Little Li was afraid that the old lady would say embarrassing words again, so she echoed, "It's raining hard, so let's go inside quickly." Mr. Zhu was very upset and scolded Lu Xiren in her heart. She shouldn't listen to Lu Xiren's words and come here to embarrass herself. When Zhu passed by Shi Niang, she bowed apologetically to Shi and whispered, "I'm sorry." Shi Niang looked at Zhu in surprise. Zhu smiled awkwardly at her, then walked past her and walked in. Old Madame Yang entered the house and did not sit down as instructed by the chamberlain. Instead, she wandered around the house. Shi Niang understood why Mrs. Yang didn't sit down. Let her wander around the house, and if Mrs. Yang doesn't sit down, Mrs. Li, Mrs. Zhu and Mrs. Li will have to accompany her. As Shi Niang said, the Chenayu Pavilion and Chenming Pavilion in Prince Jin's mansion are connected courtyards, each with its own east and west wing rooms, ear rooms, inverted seating rooms, etc. Only the main room is connected. There are a lot of rooms here. Mrs. Yang walked around for a while but couldn't find the door leading to Chenayu Pavilion. She asked Shi Niang impatiently, how to get to Chenayu Pavilion from here. Shi Niang asked, "Old lady, don't you need to have breakfast before going there?" Old Madam Yang glanced at the fully arranged round table, with a dazzling array of delicacies, and it seemed that a lot of effort had been put into it. He sneered in his heart, no wonder he wanted to bring her here and take the servants elsewhere. I brought them out, so I naturally want to go with them. How can I carry them on my back and eat alone? Old Madam Yang is really kind and generous, and I admire her deeply. Please come down with me. You can go to the dining room and report to Manager Wu, and we will start the banquet when the old lady arrives. Shi Niang first flattered Mrs. Yang, then turned to explain to the chamberlain. The chamberlain bowed in response, took 2 steps back and turned to leave. Li's mother-in-law and daughter-in-law naturally understood what Mrs. Yang meant and followed her with their hands lowered. Mrs. Zhu looked at Mrs. Yang, who was causing trouble, clenched her teeth with hatred, and reluctantly fell to the end. Shi Niang led a few people out of the living room and walked along the corridor to the main room. Shi Niang stood at the door of the hall and said, "This is the hall, please come inside." Mrs. Yang took the lead in stepping into the main room. Looking at the tall and magnificent lobby, she couldn't help but pause. Mrs. Li behind her saw that she was not moving, so she had to stop and curiously poked her head in to take a look. Wow, so impressive, Mrs. Li could not help but admire. Mrs. Li's exclamation made Mrs. Yang come back to her senses. She turned back and glared at Mrs. Li, how unskilled. Mrs. Li closed her mouth in embarrassment and stopped saying anything. Mr. Zhu and Mrs. Li entered the main room and looked at the spacious and bright main room. The various furniture made of red sandalwood, each of which was made with unique craftsmanship, made people unable to take their eyes away and made them envious. Mrs. Yang has a daughter who is a queen. She often goes to the palace. She thinks she has seen a lot of good things, but when she sees the scene in front of her, she is deeply shocked. Shi Niang looked at the people who were standing there, and said calmly, "Please come down with me." Mrs. Yang came to her senses and followed Shi Niang around the colorful wooden carving screen before entering the main room of Chenayu Pavilion. A few people were once again stunned by the decoration in the room. The decoration of Chenming Pavilion was like the bright moon in the arms, while the decoration of Chenayu Pavilion was charming and gentle, and the furnishings in the room were all soft. Shi Niang glanced at the people and walked straight forward. "Guys, please come down with me." Speaking, Shi Niang led a few people through the main room and went to the courtyard of Chenayu Pavilion. The maids on the corridor bowed their knees to greet Shi Niang. Shi Niang asked, "Where are the guests? Are they all in the dining room?" The maid leaned forward and said, "Return to Manager Shi, yes, the guests are all in the dining room, preparing to have breakfast." Shi Niang nodded, turned to Mrs. Yang and said, "Old madam, let's go over." Shi Niang said as she walked, "The wing of Chenayu Pavilion has no partitions and is reserved for entertaining guests. Therefore, I ask someone to bring the distinguished guests from the British government here directly." Mrs. Yang had a straight face and did not reply. Mrs. Li smiled apologetically and said, "The palace has thought carefully." Before Mrs. Li finished her words, Mrs. Yang turned her head and gave her a cold look. Mrs. Li swallowed back what she said. Shi Niang turned around to answer Mrs. Li's words, and just caught the scene in her eyes. She thought to herself that Mrs. Yang's temper has been the same for decades. Then, Shi Niang stopped talking. The maids and women along the way saw Shi Niang and bowed their knees to greet her. Seeing that the maid and mother-in-law were treating Shi Niang with great respect, little Li said to Mrs. Li in a low voice, "Mother, this Shi Niang seems to be not simple." Mrs. Yang snorted coldly and took over the words, "I'm just a servant. What's simple and not simple?" Mrs. Yang's voice was quite loud. Shi Niang heard it and chuckled lightly, without making any rebuttal. The group arrived at the door of the dining room. The waiter at the door bowed to Shi Niang and said, "Mr. Shi, please, the guests have already been seated. The banquet will begin when Mrs. Yang takes her seat." Shi Niang nodded, "I understand." Manager Wu, who was in charge of the dining room, saw Mrs. Yang coming in and greeted her with a smile, "Mrs. Yang is here, please come inside. Everyone, please wait for Mrs. Yang to come and start the banquet." Mrs. Yang walked into the dining room. Everyone in the room stood up when they saw Mrs. Yang coming in. Steward Wu wanted to lead Mrs. Yang to the table at the top, but Shi Niang said before Steward Wu could speak, "Everyone, please come down." When Manager Wu saw Shi Niang personally leading Mrs. Yang and his entourage to their seats, Manager Wu stepped aside. Mrs. Yang entered the room and focused all her attention on the table, staring at the breakfast on the table. When she saw that the dishes on each table were the same as those in Chenming Pavilion, Mrs. Yang said, "The breakfast in the palace is very rich." There was a bit of disbelief in her words, and she seemed a bit disappointed and a bit annoyed. Shi Niang smiled slightly and said immodestly, "Of course, those invited to the banquet today are all our prince's close relatives, so the food must be carefully selected to show our prince's sincerity." The proud look on Shi Niang's face annoyed Mrs. Yang. Mrs. Yang subconsciously raised her hand to give Shi Niang a scratch on her ear. Just as she was about to wave her hand down, someone grabbed her arm tightly and said, "Old madam, sit over here." Mammy Wang was afraid that Mrs. Yang would not be able to control her anger. After entering the house, she followed Mrs. Yang closely and blocked her attack in time. Shi Niang glanced at Grandma Wang and then called for Li and others to take their seats. Old man Yang turned his head and glanced at Grandma Wang. Grandma Wang whispered, "Old madam, this is not a British government residence. Don't be impulsive." Mrs. Li filled a bowl of rice porridge and handed it over. "Mother, finish the porridge first." Shi Niang watched Grandma Wang take the porridge and put it in front of Mrs. Yang, and stepped aside with some regret. When Mrs. Yang raised her hand, Shi Niang leaned towards her, expecting Mrs. Yang's hand to fall on her. Shi Niang didn't expect that Grandma Wang would come out halfway and pull back Mrs. Yang's raised hand, dashing her hopes. The Duke Chinquo's mansion received the letter from the Prince of Qin's mansion, and the concierge quickly reported the letter to the steward next to Mrs. Aunt Yuan. Yuan Yan received a letter, knowing that this matter was not small, and hurriedly entered the house to report to Mrs. "Madam, the prince has sent a letter, saying that Mrs. Yang from the British Duke's palace has brought the whole family to the Prince of Qin's mansion for a banquet. They have already arrived at the prince's mansion. The prince invites the old lady to come over earlier to help receive the reception." Mrs. turned her head to look at the hourglass, swallowed the porridge in her mouth, and said, "It's only the end of the month now. Didn't the old woman arrive at the palace at the beginning of the year? She also brought the whole family there. What does she want to do? Can the prince handle it?" Mrs. Jean put down the chopsticks in her hand and said, "Obviously, she is not happy to go to see the prince. I'm going to eat and change my clothes. You eat quickly, and we can set off after eating." Old Madame Yang's ability to mess around has been experienced by everyone present. Mrs. wolfed down the porridge in the bowl, put down the bowl, and stood up. "I've eaten too. Now go change clothes. Let's meet at the second gate." Seeing Mrs.'s hurried look, MRS Jean tried to persuade her, Sister Shan, don't panic. With Wei Ruo in the palace, nothing will happen. MRS Ye said, Auntie, you don't know how difficult that old woman is. If Wei is a servant, how can he deal with that old woman? MRS Jean said, then you think it's wrong. If we have to deal with MRS Yang today, we have to count on Wei Ruo. MRS Ye stopped, turned to look at MRS Jean, and asked doubtfully, Auntie, what do you mean by this? MRS Jean said, that day, when you were in the palace, did you ever hear the emperor say that Wei Ruo's position should be reduced? MRS Ye shook her head and her eyes lit up, yes, the emperor did not say that Wei Ruo's position would be reduced that day. He only said that she would be punished to go to Prince Jean's mansion to help him manage the prince's mansion. MRS Jean nodded, that's it? Wei Ruo is the person close to the empress. As a first-grade palace official, she manages the trivial affairs of the harem for the empress. This is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that Wei Ruo has a golden whip given by the emperor. Ye has always been soft-tempered. At that time, the emperor was afraid that Ye was weak and would be bullied by others, so he gave Wei Ruo a golden whip. If anyone dared to be disrespectful to Ye, Wei Ruo could use the golden whip to whip them. MRS Yang dares to act wild in Prince Jean's palace today, and Wei Ruo will definitely take care of her. MRS Ye was very happy when she heard this. Why don't I know about this? MRS Jean said, you went to the border at that time. How would you know? When you came back later, the empress had gone. If Wei was missing, who would mention it? Then what are you waiting for? Let's pack up quickly. By the way, today I have to find a way to add more firewood, light up the fire, and then watch the show, MRS Ye said with some enthusiasm. End of this chapter. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 293. Chapter 293 Attending the Banquet 4. In the reception room of Qinhui Pavilion in Prince Jean's mansion, Le Shun came in and reported, Your Majesty, the concierge has come to report that the old lady of Duke Qinquo's mansion, my uncle, and their car have passed Bama Mountain. Coming from Duke Qinquo's mansion, Bama Mountain is a must-pass, and it's about a quarter of an hour's drive from Prince Jean's mansion. King Qin nodded, okay, I understand. Have you gone to the backyard to inform Shi Niang? Le Shun replied, I have already sent someone to inform you. Qin dynasty Lu Dingning cupped his hands and said, Second uncle and everyone, please sit down for a moment while I go out to greet my grandmother and the others. Lu Dingning then stood up with his hands raised and said, MRS Qin is an elder. I will go with the prince to greet you. Lu Xiran, Lu Zixun, and others saw Lu Ningning standing up and followed suit. When King Qin saw that everyone was following him, he hurriedly said, You're welcome. Sit down. I'll go and come back. Since the green light incident caused him to lose his official position, Lu Dingning has been asking people everywhere to find connections, hoping to find him a job. At first, he placed his hope on the King Xian, hoping that he could go to the King Xian's palace to make a long history, or even be a staff member. He hinted to the wise king several times, but the wise king pretended to be confused with him. Much to his disappointment. Now that Lu Ziqin has become the king of Qin, Lu Dingning's mind becomes active again. From Lu Dingning's perspective, when the Prince of Qin's palace was first built, it was the time when people were needed. He also said that he has been a waiter who has been the Ministry of War for many years. Lu Dingning insisted, it's not polite for us to sit here. I'd better go with the prince to say hello to MRS Qin. Seeing his persistence, King Qin said, okay, let's go together. The king of Qin led a group of people to greet him at the gate of the palace. After a short wait, the carriages and horses from the Qingqiu palace arrived. Yamingkin rode at the front. When he saw King Qin, he dismounted from the horse far away, handed the reins to the boy, stepped forward to greet King Qin and said, "Hello, Your Majesty, my father has gone to the yamen, and my brother has gone to hand over the reins business, come back later." King Qin returned the courtesy and said, "Hello, cousin, are my grandmother and the others here?" "Here, we are all here," in the car at the back. After saying that, Yamingkin raised his hands to greet Lu Dingning and others. MRS Qin's car stopped. King Qin stepped forward to say hello to MRS Qin. He helped MRS Qin out of the car with his own hands and reminded her from time to time, "Grandma, please slow down." The love King Qin showed for MRS Qin envied those who stopped to watch. Some people couldn't help but sigh, "MRS Qin is so lucky." MRS Qin held Prince Qin's hand tightly and said with a smile, "Okay. You are the prince now, so you don't need to greet him personally. We can just go in by ourselves. This is etiquette." MRS Qin lowered her voice much later. King Qin said, in Zikin's heart, his grandmother is always the closest and most respected person. It is only etiquette to go out to greet your relatives. MRS Qin raised her head to look at King Qin. King Qin just looked down at MRS Qin. Their eyes met. MRS Qin saw the warmth and respect in King Qin's eyes that reached her heart. "Zikin has always been my grandmother's good grandson," MRS Qin replied movedly. King Qin smiled and nodded, "Yes, Zikin knows." MRS Qin patted King Qin's hand and asked with concern, "Mr. Yang is not making trouble unreasonably, is she?" King Qin shook his head and said, "Shi Niang is receiving the reception in the backyard. So far, I haven't received any bad news. It should be that there was no trouble, or she made a trouble and was resolved by Shi Niang." Lu Zixun saw that the king of Qin was particularly close to the people in Qingqiu Palace, and whispered to Lu Ziren in a low voice, "Did you see it? What is the difference between closeness and distance? This is the close one. Even if we let him live in our house for another 20 years and give him free rice for another 20 years, he will never be as close to us as he is to the people in the Duke's house." Lvzu, who was born as a concubine, has always shared their anger with Lu Zixun. After hearing what Lu Zixun said, Lu Ziu said in a strange tone, "That is, my grandmother and MRS Qin are both the old ladies of the Duke's mansion. When Grandma came over, the prince only met the screen wall, and Grandma didn't even see his figure. MRS Qin came to the palace, but the king of Qin personally welcomed her out." In this regard, the difference was obvious. Lu Zijian stood next to Lu Ziren, listening to the words of Lu Zixun and Lu Ziu in his heart, and didn't like the yin and yang tone of the two. He lowered his voice and said, "The feelings between people are mutual. If you are good to others, they will be good to you. As for my grandmother's treatment of Zikin, how can Zikin be kind to her?" Lu Zixun turned his head and glanced at Lu Zijian, and said, "Ha! You always defend him everywhere. You are good to him, but you have never seen how good he is to you. Has King Qin said a word to you today?" Lu Ziu took the words and said, "Do you want the king of Qin to talk to him? Zikin didn't want to talk to him when he was not a prince. What's more, he is a high-ranking prince now. It's strange that he would pay attention to him." Lu Zifeng, the elder brother of Lu Zijian's mother, saw Lu Zixun and Lu Zijian trying to squeeze Lu Zijian, and said in support, "Why didn't King Qin talk to Zijian?" Just now in the living room, King Qin and Zijian had a few words. Lu Zifeng has practiced martial arts since he was a child and has a lot of strength. He is the only member of the Lu family who is in the military. He used to be at the border with Lu Dinkin and was transferred to the Jiangyi camp 3 months ago. He has been at home on vacation these days. Among the brothers, Lu Zifeng has the most stupid mouth and the most upright temperament. Lu Zixun sneered, Um, 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 how many times does it count as talking? Are you afraid that you have been in the army for a long time and you are stupid? Lu Zifeng said, the king of Qin is at least willing to say yes and yes twice to Zijian. It is much better than those who say things that no one else is willing to listen to. Lu Zixun said several words to the king of Qin with a sullen face today, but the king of Qin ignored him. You. Lu Zixun puffed up his chest and stared at Lu Zifeng. Lu Zifeng raised his fist and asked, what? Do you want to fight? The king of Qin is here, please calm down, Lu Ziren said with a serious face. Over there, a group of people stood waiting for King Qin to speak to Mrs. Qin. Mrs. Qin looked at the gap between the conversation between King Qin and Mrs. Qin, and interjected with a smile, the prince always has endless things to say when he sees my mother-in-law. The king of Qin let go of Mrs. Qin's hand, turned around and bowed her hands to Mrs. Qin in greeting, hello, aunt. Mrs. Qin returned the favor with a smile and said hello repeatedly. King Qin straightened up, turned to Mrs. Ye and bowed deeply, hello, aunt. Mrs. Ye stretched out her hand to help King Qin, okay, I'm late. Is everything okay in the house? King Qin nodded, don't worry, aunt, everything is fine. Lu Zixun saw that the king of Qin continued to greet the people of Qingqiu Palace, curled his lips and said, they are relatives, and there are endless things to say when we meet. Lu Dingning turned around and glared at Lu Zixun. Lu Zixun closed his mouth, touched his nose with his hand and lowered his head. Lu Dingning saw the king of Qin and the people from Duke Qingqiu's palace finished the ceremony, and smiled and stepped forward to greet Mrs. Qin. Lu Ziren and his brothers followed and cupped their hands, and Mrs. Qin smiled and said a few words. Mrs. Qin finished her greetings and turned around to see Xi Niang. Before she could speak, Xi Niang had already knelt down in front of her and said with a choked voice, old madam, this slave is back. Mrs. Qin hugged Xi Niang into her arms, patted her on the shoulder and said, it's good to come back. I've been dreaming about you coming back. Hearing the heartwarming words, Xi Niang lay in Mrs. Qin's arms and cried silently. Mrs. Qin allowed her to hug her and cry, and only patted her shoulder gently. It wasn't until Xi Niang calmed down that Mrs. Qin said gently, get up, this is not the time to reminisce about the past. After today, let's find some time and let the two of us talk in detail slowly. Xi Niang nodded obediently, stood up, and said back, okay. I will listen to the old lady. Le Shun wiped the corners of his eyes and said, let's stop standing at the door and go to the mansion first. Ye Mingqin responded with a smile, yes, let's go to the mansion first. King Qin walked over and took Mrs. Qin's arm, Grandma, let's go, we're entering the house. Mrs. Qin raised her head to look at the plaque hanging on the vermilion door, feeling mixed feelings in her heart. He nodded slightly and said, let's go in. I haven't entered this mansion for more than 20 years. King Qin said, everything in the mansion remains the same. From now on, my grandmother will come to live there permanently. Mrs. Qin smiled and nodded, okay. Grandma will listen to your arrangements. The king of Qin sent Mr. Qin and his party to Chinayu Pavilion. When old Madame Yang saw King Qin helping old Madame Qin in, her face darkened again and again, and her eyes were filled with a cold and gloomy light. This evil deed was deliberately intended to embarrass her. Everyone stood up, and Mrs. Yang got up too. She glanced at Mrs. Qin's legs and asked, sister, when did your leg get hurt? Mrs. Qin was stunned for a moment. She looked up and saw Mrs. Yang's sarcastic look, and immediately understood what she meant. Smiled and said, thank you, Sister Qian, for your concern. My leg is fine, it's fine. Just now I was telling the prince that our family went to Cin temple to burn incense a few days ago. I was able to walk from the foot of the mountain to the top of the mountain, and then walk down from the top of the mountain alone without anyone's support. Originally, I wanted to take credit from the prince, but I didn't want to be scolded by the prince. Your Majesty said that I should obey my elders and not show off my talents in places where I shouldn't. He also said that if I was injured, he could not feel the pain for me and could only feel worried. If I don't think about myself, I should also think about him. Mrs. Yang originally wanted to make fun of Mrs. Jean with a few words to embarrass Mrs. Jean in front of others, but she didn't expect that Mrs. Jean's words were like a thorn in her heart. Mrs. Yang said with a smile, "Sister, I have a good figure and I am a blessed person." Mrs. Jean nodded without humility, "To be fair to Sister Qian, I think so too. These days, I always think that for us good people, God will definitely see it when he opens his eyes. God is merciful and will definitely reward good people." No, the eldest son of the emperor who has been looking for so many years has been found. As the old saying goes, God is watching when people do things, and there are gods 3 feet above the head. Sister Qian, this is true. Mrs. Jean's question, can Mrs. Yang say that it's not true? No, she could only nod and reply, yes, the old saying is true. Mrs. Jean continued, good people will be rewarded, and bad people will get what they deserve. This is only fair, right? Mrs. Yang nodded and said, of course, good deeds and evil deeds will be rewarded. Mrs. Jean walked over and sat down next to Mrs. Yang. She motioned to the people sitting there and said, sit down. Everyone, sit down and talk slowly. After finishing speaking, Mrs. Jean turned to look at Mrs. Yang, and continued the previous topic, so, I have to be in good health to see the day when the bad guys are punished. The poison on our father-in-law and the poison on Sister Shan are all caused by evil-minded people. Sister Qian, tell me, can I wait until that day with my body? After hearing what Mrs. Jean said, Mrs. Yang's hand holding the tea stopped and she almost spilled the tea. Mr. Yang turned his head and looked at Mrs. Jean in astonishment. When he saw Mrs. Jean looking at her with a half smile, he became even more panicked. He stuttered and replied, of course. Sister's body is strong, you can definitely see it. Mrs. Jean nodded with a smile on her face, I think so too. Mrs. Yang lowered her head and took a sip of tea, forcing herself to calm down. She told herself over and over in her heart that Qin Yu just deceived her. How could she know that it had happened for decades? After King Qin sent Mrs. Jean in, he was about to leave, but when his grandmother brought the topic to the matter of his aunt's poisoning, he stayed a little longer. So, King Qin took in Mrs. Yang's reaction. Mrs. Yang raised her head inadvertently, and met King Qin's slightly scrutinizing gaze, and her heart suddenly skipped a beat. From the evil eyes, she was sure that they were suspicious of her. Mrs. Yang's mind was spinning again and again, and she asked tentatively, Sister, isn't it? Didn't Ye Shangshu die of illness? Why was he still poisoned? Why haven't I heard you talk about this before? Also, Sister, what do you think is the poison on Sister Shan's body? Sister Shan was poisoned? How long did it take? Which doctor did you invite to see me? Aren't you mistaken? Mrs. Jean picked up the teacup unhurriedly, lowered her head and took a sip, then put the teacup back on the table, and then said quietly, you can't be wrong, the poison in our Duke's mansion was diagnosed by Dr. Hu and Dr. Su from the Imperial Hospital. Yes, it's absolutely true. As for the poison on Sister Shan's body, we asked experts to find out. Is the poison on Ye Shangshu's body the same as the poison on Sister Shan's body? Old sister, you should have told me this earlier. After all, I am also Sister Shan's mother-in-law. Sister Shan, too, why didn't you tell me about such a big thing? Old Mrs. Yang turned her head to look at Ye Shan and began to blame. Mrs. Yang's words were full of concern. When she heard that Ye Shan was about to vomit, she secretly cursed the old witch for being so good at pretending. Without waiting for Ye Shan to reply, MRS Jean first said, "Today is a good day for the prince to entertain guests, so let's not talk about it." MRS Yang originally wanted to test how much MRS Jean knew, but she didn't expect that the old woman only said a few words and was unwilling to say more. "Your Majesty, the King of Qi has arrived," Lai Shun came in to report. "I understand," King Qin responded, turned to MRS Jean and said, "Grandma, I'm going to do some work first." MRS Jean waved her hand, "Go quickly, don't keep people waiting." Others in the Qin dynasty bowed their hands and turned around and left the living room. End of this chapter. The Rebirth of Space, the Lucky Girl from a Farm Family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 294. Chapter 294 Huarujun. MRS Yang was so immersed in her own thoughts that she didn't even notice that King Qin had left her. MRS Jean saw that she had become surprisingly quiet, so she took the initiative to talk to her. "When did Sister Qian arrive?" MRS Yang was stunned and did not respond. MRS Jean asked again. Grandma Wang stood beside MRS Yang and reached out to hold her hand. Old Madame Yang came back to her senses, turned to look at Grandma Wang, and asked, "What's the matter?" Mother Wang looked at MRS Jean, lowered her head and said to MRS Yang, "My dear wife, I asked you when did you arrive?" MRS Yang looked at MRS Jean and replied, "Oh, the banquet hosted by King Qin today is equivalent to the joy of Qin's residence. We have to set out before dawn, and then go brighter and brighter as we go. It indicates that King Qin's days will be brighter and brighter. The better. So we came here early." MRS Jean secretly thought, "I believe you are a ghost." But with a smile on his face, he said, "Sister Qian is interested, no wonder King Qin likes you. Every time King Qin comes back to Qingqiu's mansion, he always talks about you and how well you treat him. It puts me, my maternal grandmother, to shame. Who wouldn't be able to tell lies with your eyes open?" MRS Jean said it very sincerely. MRS Yang said embarrassedly, "Sister, don't say that, it makes me feel embarrassed. Actually, what I do are all trivial things. I got up early in the morning and I feel a little sleepy now. I want to close my eyes for a while and stop chatting with my elder sister." MRS Yang couldn't continue acting anymore and hurriedly ended the topic. MRS Jean didn't want to let her go, and continued, "Sister Qian is still as humble as ever. You have done so much for the King of Qin and for Sister Shan, how can it be insignificant? That is a kindness as heavy as a mountain. Our whole family will remember your good deeds. Especially Zikin, this child is the most grateful. Now that he is a prince and capable, he will definitely repay you. I will give you back double what you have done over the years." MRS Yang was made very uncomfortable by MRS Jean's pointed words. She closed her eyes in a panic and pretended to sleep. MRS Jean's words not only upset MRS Yang, but also made all the Li family present panic. Especially Mr. Li, who is young and has not experienced much. She feels like she has attended a hangman banquet today. MRS Jean shut up when she saw Yang closing her eyes, turned around, called Shi Niang to her side, and started talking to Shi Niang in a low voice. MRS Ye had a fight with Li's mother-in-law and daughter-in-law before. Now that they have met, although they can't be said to be jealous of each other, they really don't want to talk to these two people. MRS Ye turned around and came together with Ye Mingjin, and the aunt and nephew chatted in low voices. Little MRS Li became anxious, and asked in a low voice, "Mom, we fought against my uncle that day. Will she bear a grudge and take revenge on us?" Li lowered her voice to comfort. MRS Jian sat next to MRS Jean, moved her body towards MRS Jean, and listened to MRS Jean and Shi Niang talking. Of the people in the house, MRS Zhu was the only one who was bored and didn't know who to talk to. She sat there looking at this and that. Finally, she got up and went outside the house, standing on the corridor to look at the royal chrysanthemums in the drizzle. King Qin went to the outer courtyard and walked to the screen wall, where he saw Ruan Chu walking towards King Qi from the entrance of the mansion. The king of Qin smiled and greeted him. After some greetings, he politely led the king of Qi to the living room. As soon as King Qi was settled here, the porter came again and said, "Your Majesty, King Chen, King Chu, and King Xian have arrived." King Qi heard that King Chen, King Chu, and King Xian were gathered together, and his eyes darkened. Everyone in the Qin dynasty cupped their hands and turned around to greet him. On the corridor, King Qin met the three princes and their entourage who had already entered the palace and came this way. He smiled and cupped his hands and said, "It's just a good time for you three to get together." King Chen bowed to greet him and said, "Brother Huang is right, what a coincidence. That day when we were offering sacrifices at the ancestral temple, we agreed to come together to visit the Prince of Qin's mansion today. It just so happened that the Emperor said that we would have a banquet today, so the three of us came over at the time we had agreed." Among the princes, King Qi usually behaves like an eldest brother and rarely interacts with the three younger ones. The three younger ones also don't like the self-righteous King Qi, so they rarely ask King Qi when they meet for fun. King Qin's eyes fell on Huarujun behind King Xian, and his hands tightened slightly. When Huarujun saw King Qin looking at him, he stepped forward and raised his hands to King Qin. "Hello, King Qin. I am Huarujun. I am coming to the King of Qin's mansion for a banquet with our prince." King Qin returned the gift and said, "Hello, Mr. Hua, welcome." Subsequently, King Qin bowed to King Chen's attendant Jishiu, and King Chu's attendant Lan Yi bowed his hands before politely letting the group of people go to the reception room. When Huarujun entered the living room, he was so shocked that Lu Zixun, who was throwing peanuts to feed him, smashed the peanuts into his face and looked at Huarujun with a ghostly expression. "Why are you here?" Huarujun cupped his hands towards Lu Zixun and said, "I came with the prince." "Your Majesty, which prince?" Lu Zixun stood up and asked. Not only Lu Zixun was surprised, but other people in the British government were also surprised, and they all looked at Huarujun. Due to the relationship between the Lu family and the Li family, and because Lu Ziqiu married Huaruiming, the Lu family was no stranger to Huarujun. Huarujun looked at Xian Wang and said nothing. The wise king said, "October comes with me." Ming Grui is Huarujun's character. Lu Zixun pointed at Huarujun and asked in disbelief, "He, the son of a prostitute, works in Prince Xian's mansion, and he can still travel with the prince to a banquet." Huarujun's biological mother was a prostitute that Huasu brought back from the brothel. The sentence "son of a prostitute" made Huarujun's eyes darken and the fists in his hands tightened. The wise king lowered his face and said to Lu Zixun, "Zixun, please be careful what you say. Does the prince, General, Xiangning, have any idea? What's more, who do I use? You don't need to question me." Lu Dingning was aroused by Xian Wang's who to use. Thinking about the various hints he had given these days, Xian Wang did not give himself any face, turned around and took the son of a prostitute with him. "I am his biological uncle." Lu Dingning looked at the wise king with great disappointment, and snorted coldly, "A born from a prostitute, who can't even take part in the scientific examination, dares to be compared with the princes and generals? The prince is not afraid of humiliating the princes and generals." Lu Dingning's anger shocked everyone present. Of course, because of the different identities and positions of the people present, the degree of surprise varied. King Qi held the teacup in his hand, squinting his eyes while drinking tea and watching the show. When Lu Dingning was serving as a minister in the Ministry of War, he had someone check him out. Many things found out show that Lu Dingning is a person with a mouth before a brain. Looking at Lao Wu, who was so angry that he was about to vomit blood, Lu Ning decided that this man had not let him down. The king of Qi felt a sense of schadenfreude in his heart. The king of Chen and the king of Chu, who came in together with the Xian king. When the king of Chu saw that King Xian had a dispute with the Lu family, he stepped forward to persuade him, "Old Wu, forget it, stop saying a few words. Today is a good day for the emperor, don't miss out on the emperor's happiness." After saying that, the king of Chu turned to Lu Dingning and said, "Shilang Lu, if you have any questions, let's talk about it some other time, okay? Today is a good day for the emperor's brother to entertain you." When Lu Dingning heard the king of Chu calling him Lu Shilang, he thought the king of Chu was mocking him and replied angrily, "Your Majesty, this is between me and the wise king. Please stop meddling in your own business." The king of Chu did not expect that his good intentions would not be appreciated by others, and he would be accused of being nosy. A king in the dignified church, who saw him was not respectful. Being scolded in public today, King Chu felt so embarrassed. He spread his hands and laughed at himself, "Okay, I'm sorry, it was me who was meddling in other people's business just now. You can continue as you like." King Chu turned around and gave King Chen a hand, "Third brother, let's go over and sit down. Don't disturb Lao Wu and his uncle's talk." King Chen allowed King Chu to pull him to sit opposite King Chi. King Chen raised his head and saw King Chi. King Chi held a teacup and saluted him. The king of Qi of the Chen dynasty cupped his hands and said, "Hello, second brother." Qi dynasty nodded slightly to him as a greeting. Lu Zijian was working in Prince Yan's mansion, and he had to come forward to persuade him both publicly and privately, so he said, "Second uncle, if you have anything to say, let's talk about it after we go back. Zi Qin, the king of Qin invites you today. It's very inappropriate for us to do this." Huarujun looked at the furious Lu Dingning, and then at the wise king who was staring at Lu Dingning with a sullen face. He took a step forward, leaned forward, and said, "Your Majesty, I'll go down first." The wise king said calmly, "No need, you are my king's bodyguard. You should be by my side. You don't need to care what others say." "Is he working as a bodyguard beside the prince?" Lu Zixun looked at Huarujun and asked. The wise king rolled his eyes at him, "What else?" It turned out that he was just a guard. Lu Dingning realized that he was impulsive and immediately bowed to the wise king and said, "Your Majesty, what's that? I couldn't help myself just now." The wise king did not look at Lu Dingning and his son anymore, and said to Huarujun behind him, "You come with me." Huarujun leaned forward and said, "Yes." Wang Xian took Huarujun to the table next to King Qi and sat down. King Xian sat in the front row, and Huarujun sat behind King Xian. Lu Dingning saw King Xian walking away without looking at him. He knew that he had annoyed people today, so he chased after King Xian and sat down at the table next to King Xian. He smiled apologetically and said, "Your Majesty, I just made a mistake and said something I shouldn't have said. It's all my fault. I'm here to apologize to the prince, and I also ask the prince to forgive me. I promise that I will never do it again next time." Lu Dingning is a person who makes mistakes quickly and admits his mistakes quickly. Every time he makes a mistake, he will promise not to make it again. But when something happens, his temper will rise immediately, and he will throw his guarantee out of the blue. When he realizes that he was wrong, he will quickly admit his mistake. Just like this, stick to the sufferer until the sufferer nods and forgives him. The Xian king was annoyed today and turned a blind eye to Lu Dingning's apology. He turned sideways and bowed his hands to King Qi and said, "Hello, second brother." King Qi raised the teacup in his hand, smiled and nodded, as a return gift. Seeing that the wise king ignored him, Lu Dingning continued, "My lord, I'm just outspoken, I really don't have any bad intentions. For the sake of your empress, the prince will forgive me this time. I promise that I will never do it again next time." The wise king was upset by Lu Dingning. He was very helpless. He had to suppress the anger in his heart and said gently to Lu Dingning, "I know what happened just now was unintentional. I am not angry with my second uncle. There is no need for my second uncle, keep this in mind. Lu Dingning was forgiven by the Xian King, and he felt comfortable. He had no intention of leaving, and talked to the Xian King when he had nothing to say. Lu Xiren had long seen the impatience of the wise king, but he hated Lu Dingning in his heart and did not want to talk to Lu Dingning, so he pretended not to know and chatted with Lu Zifeng. The Xian Wang looked at Lu Xiren several times, hoping that he could invite Lu Dingning away. Lu Xiren and Lu Zifeng got together and didn't know what to say. They didn't look at him at all, which made the Xian Wang very angry. Lu Zijian saw that the wise king was looking at Lu Xiren frequently, got up and walked over, and asked in a low voice, "Your Majesty, is there something wrong?" The wise king glanced at Lu Xiren and waved to Lu Zijian, who lowered his head. The wise king confessed, "Find a way to take your second uncle away, immediately." Lu Zijian was annoyed that he had caused a big trouble for himself, so he agreed bravely, "Okay. I understand." Lu Zijian responded, but his mind was blank. He didn't know how to get Lu Dingning away. From the moment he entered the living room, King Qin had been standing aside with his hands lowered, watching the turmoil rise and fall with cold eyes. It wasn't until King Xian sat down that King Qin followed suit. The King of Qin was surprised that the wise king could tolerate Lu Dingning and Lu Zixun today. In recent years, the wise king's temperament has changed a lot. Of course, the wise king hates a person, and when he wants to take this person away from him, his slightly pouting mouth and the flash of disgust in his eyes remain unchanged. The King of Qin saw that Lu Zijian's brows were knotted with worry and knew that he was in trouble. He didn't want the banquet to be disturbed by Lu Dingning and his son, so he opened his mouth and said to Lu Dingning, "Second uncle, sit over here. I have a few words to say to you." As soon as Lu Dingning heard King Qin calling him, he quickly stood up from his seat and said, "Okay, come over here." When Lu Zijian saw Lu Dingning being called away by the King of Qin, he cast a grateful look towards the King of Qin, but the King of Qin's eyes fell on Lu Dingning and did not look at him at all. Lu Dingning sat next to King Qin and asked, "What are you talking about?" "King Qin, please tell me." King Qin smiled and said softly, "I don't have much to say. I just haven't spoken to my second uncle for a long time and I want to talk to him." Lu Dingning wanted to seek a job in the King of Qin's palace, and he was eager to have the opportunity to talk to the King of Qin and get close to each other. "Yes, the last time we sat together and talked was 6 or 7 years ago," Lu Dingning said. King Qin asked incredulously, "Has it been so long? I don't even remember." Lu Dingning sat up straight and said very seriously, "Why didn't it take so long? The last time we sat together and talked was before you traveled. The wise king didn't want to be separated from you and shouted that he would travel with you. The wise king will come down to intercede with you and let you take him with you. That time, I went to see you at Shu Cinema. We chatted in the study room of Shu Cinema for most of an hour. Do you remember it? Are Yuan beside you is also present?" How could King Qin not remember that incident? It was during that long conversation that he accidentally made a mistake, which almost made him unable to come back. End of this chapter. The Rebirth of Space, the Lucky Girl from a Farm Family. Author, He Would Fire Every. Chapter 295. Chapter 295 Consideration. After Mrs. Yang knew that Xi Niang had a golden whip, she hoped that Mrs. Yang would show off her unreasonable momentum in the British government, so that Xi Niang could use the golden whip to sweep away Her Majesty. Mrs. Yang, on the other hand, was uncharacteristically uncharacteristic. She just leaned on the chair and took a nap as if she had taken the wrong medicine. Mrs. Yang wanted to add more firewood, but the sparks were out, so it was useless for her to add more firewood, right? Xi Niang chatted with Mrs. Qin, and often looked back at Mrs. Yang. Seeing her twisting her neck, Xi Niang finally couldn't help it and asked, "Isn't Mrs. Yang comfortable sleeping like this?" Do you want to go to the bed in the house? Lie down and rest. Mrs. Yang waved her hands, closed her eyes and said, "No, you guys talk about your business, I'll just stay here and lean on you. You don't have to worry about me." Seeing that she insisted on staying, Shi Niang didn't persuade her much and let her sleep on the chair. Mrs. Yang slept on the chair for more than an hour. She didn't open her eyes until the servants came in to announce that dinner was ready, and she went to the dining room with everyone to eat. After lunch, Mrs. Yang stood up to say goodbye and left the Prince of Qin's mansion with the people from the British Duke's mansion. Mrs. Yang looked at the retreating figure and asked, "What does this old woman mean? She made such a big fuss and came over to take a nap all morning and then went back. It's so abnormal. Is she changing her gender?" Mrs. Jean withdrew her gaze and said while walking back, "You are used to being abused. Once she is normal, you are not used to it." Mrs. Ye shook her head and said, "The situation is easy to change, but the character is hard to change. Will the old woman be normal? What she looks like today can only mean that there is something on her mind." Mrs. Jean and Mrs. Yang went back and forth a few times, and they had a vague answer in their hearts. However, when it comes to the Queen's death, she cannot make rash remarks without evidence. She will wait until there is evidence. The group returned to the living room, and soon King Qin came over with Yeming Hao and Yeming Qin. Mrs. Jean asked, "Everyone has left?" King Qin nodded and said, "They're all gone. Does Grandma need a lunch break?" Mrs. Jean shook her head and said, "No, we should go back if we sit down for a while." King Qin said, "I asked Shi Niang to clean up a few courtyards and come out. I hope you, Grandma, can stay here for a while." Mrs. Jian smiled and said, "Anyang and Sister Shan can stay. I have to go back. There needs to be someone in the house who can do it." Mrs. Jean shook her head with a smile and said, "We won't stay here today. When the prince gets married and there is a princess in charge of the house, we will come and stay again." Mrs. Ye smiled and said, "Your Majesty, my mother is urging you to get married. Your Majesty, please marry Yan Ran back as soon as possible. By the way, I remember Yan Ran's birthday is the first day of October. It's time to get haircut this year. When will the haircut ceremony be held? After you are beautiful and beautiful, you can discuss the marriage, so that the prince can ask the emperor to grant you a marriage." King Qin said, "The wedding ceremony may only last a few days. As for the marriage proposal, it is not that fast yet. Yan Ran will not be willing to discuss the marriage until she avenges the Hua family." Mrs. Ye said with some worry, "The criminal department has been investigating this case for more than 10 years but has not been able to find it out. Can it still be found out?" King Qin leaned back on the chair, gently tapped the armrest of the chair with the pad of his right index finger, and said thoughtfully, "As long as someone investigates, the truth will be revealed one day." Mrs. Jean nodded and said, "I agree with the prince. As long as someone investigates such a big case and investigates it carefully, they will be able to find clues and then find out the truth." Mrs. Ye agreed in her heart with what her mother and King Qin said. Although this case was a big case, the Hua family was in ruins and everyone was dead, and no one urged it. Who would do their best to investigate it? It is normal to have no results in the Ministry of Punishment. It's just that many years have passed and the murderer has already destroyed the evidence. How can anyone investigate? Taking a step back, even if it can be found out, how long will it take? A year and a half? Or 3 to 5 years? Your Majesty is not young this year. It would be easier to wait for a year and a half, but if you wait for 3 to 5 years. Mrs. Ye's thoughts were interrupted by King Qin, and, yesterday when Jin went to the British Duke's mansion to deliver a post, I learned that the Duke of Guo and his servants had gone to pick up my uncle. Mrs. Jean sat up straight and asked, "The British father has gone to pick up my uncle? How long has it been?" King Qin nodded. Yes, the British Duke's servants said they set off the day before yesterday. Mrs. Qin and Mrs. Ye looked at each other and asked, do you know how long it will take for my uncle to return to the capital? King Qin said, I heard from my father that day that my uncle has entered the capital. Calculating the time, he will arrive in the capital in 2 days. Mrs. Jian looked at Mrs. Ye and asked, in the past, when my uncle came back, the British father would also go to pick him up. Mrs. Ye shook her head, never before. In the past few years, the prince has come back 3 times, and this year is the 4th time. Before, when the prince returned to the capital, he would go directly to the palace to meet the saint, and then go back to the mansion. Meet the duke in Wenyuan Pavilion. Mrs. Jean frowned slightly and said quietly, the British man is rushing to see my uncle, I'm afraid something bad will happen. Mrs. Jian asked, what could it be? Is it because of the fight between Sister Shan and Li? Or is it because Zi Qin is a prince? Mrs. Jean said, the one who can make the British father-in-law run around is the latter. King Qin said, I suddenly became the king of Qin and stood on the opposite side of the wise king, which made them nervous. So the duke of the country rushed over in a hurry. He was probably going to help the wise king. Mrs. Jean nodded, looked at King Qin and asked, what are your plans now? King Qin said, my father asked me to take a post in the Ministry of Punishment. Starting tomorrow, I will have to go to the morning court every day, and then work in the yamen of the Ministry of Punishment. Right now, I just want to find out the Hua family case as soon as possible. At this point, King Qin paused slightly, and then said, there is also the cause of the mother's death. As for other things, I didn't think much about it. Mrs. Jean nodded and said, do what the emperor has told you and protect yourself. As for other things, there is no need to think too much. Mrs. Ye looked at King Qin and asked, Zi Qin doesn't want to sit in that position. King Qin shook his head and said, I don't want to think about it now. As for whether I will think about it in the future, it's hard to say now. We have to wait until later. Mrs. Jian said, for such a big thing, shouldn't we take precautions and make plans in advance? King Qin smiled and said, my father is in the prime of spring and autumn, and he has been in that position for a long time. With my father guarding the high position, I can just be a leisurely king of Qin. Why bother to think about those things that are there and not there? Mrs. Jean nodded and reminded, that's the truth. Your Majesty has thought it through. Although your Majesty doesn't fight, he can't stand someone who wants to fight for it. Your Majesty needs to be more vigilant and don't follow other people's ways. Mrs. Jian took the words and said, Anyang, don't worry about this. It's fine if others don't follow the prince's rules. Mrs. Jean smiled and said, that's true, but it's always better to be more careful. The king of Qin leaned forward and said, thank you, Grandma, I will do it. Old man Qin and others drank 2 more cups of tea and chatted with each other before standing up to leave. The king of Qin sent everyone from the Qingqiu palace to the gate, watched the carriage go away, and then turned around and walked into the courtyard. Rugjuan asked, why didn't the prince tell his wife that the prince brought his aunt back to Beijing? After Ryujing came back to report that the British Duke had gone to pick up Lu Dinkin, the king of Qin felt uneasy, so he finally arranged for someone to go find out more about it. Just before King Qin came to the backyard, the inquirer came back to report that Lu Dinkin had arrived in the Qiangshan area today and would arrive tomorrow afternoon. Outside the city, there was a beautiful woman and her son who entered the city early the next morning. Accompanying Lu Dinkin and returning to the capital, there was also a beautiful woman and her son. King Qin raised his hand and pressed his brow, and said, let me find out more information about the woman and the child. The more detailed the information, the better. Rugjuan leaned forward and said, okay, I'll make arrangements right now. King Qin continued, Tell Ruan Chu that I am going to Wuotong Lane and ask him to replace the bright guard with the dark guard. Rugjuan lowered his hands in response, took 2 steps back and turned around to leave. On the other side, at the Uella Inn in Wulio Town at the foot of Kyangshan Mountain, Lu Dinkin, the British prince's son, poured a cup of tea for the British prince and said, "Father, let your son think about this matter again." The British duke looked at Lu Dinkin and asked, "What else is there to think about? The Xianwang is Dinjian's child and your wife. If you don't help the Xianwang, who will you help? Zikin, it is true that he has been your son for 20 years, but he is not your son after all. The wise king is your blood relative. Speaking of this matter, I feel angry in my heart. Mrsya is so courageous that she dares to pick up a child and bring her back to be the legitimate son of my British prince. I haven't settled the matter with her yet." Lu Dinkin looked up at the British Duke and asked, "How do you want to settle the score with Sister Shan? Father needs to think about it carefully. Zikin is a dragon and a prince." The British Duke blurted out, "Our family is not short of princes." After speaking, Ying Ying glared at Lu Dinkin angrily and said, "She has allowed you to be a cheap daddy for 20 years, and you still protect her? Huh." LV Dinkin lowered his head to drink tea and stopped talking. What the British Duke said is true. It is a great joy for King Qin to deal with other families. But if it falls in the British government, it will cause trouble for others. There is no shortage of princes in the British government. The appearance of King Qin gave the wise king an extra competitor out of thin air. Those competitors who knew their ins and outs had to be feared. Seeing that his son remained silent, the British public became even more angry. "Look at you, whenever I talk about Ye family, you look like this. Did I make a mistake? What has Mr. Ye done for this family in these years? She has been living in the Chinquo Palace for many years. Does she regard herself as a member of the British Duke's palace?" Lu Dinkin raised his head and looked at the British father-in-law. Father only knew that Mr. Ye did not live at home. What about mother's attitude towards her? Why didn't father tell me? If mother could treat Ms. Ye a little better, would Ms. Ye not live in the house? The British Duke said with a bluffing face, "You dare to talk back to me? Okay, very good. Where is your filial piety? There are no bad parents in the world. Besides, what's wrong with Yang's treatment of Ye? Which daughter-in-law in the world does not want to serve her parents-in-law at her husband's house, or greet her mother-in-law in the morning and dusk? When Mrs. Ye is in the house, Mrs. Yang doesn't need her to greet her in the morning and dusk. She doesn't need her to wait on her when she's in bed." Looking around the capital, whose daughter-in-law can be like this? How do you want Yang to treat her? Lu Dinkin didn't know the situation in the house, and of course, he wasn't the kind of person to listen to one side of the story. "My son believes that what dad said is true, but my son knows that Ye is not an unreasonable person who does not understand etiquette and is unreasonable. There must be a reason for the situation like this. 3 days of freezing is no better than 1 day of freezing. If Ye hadn't been heartbroken, she would never have done such a thing. When the son meets Ye, he will ask her about the specific situation before making a final conclusion." The British Duke snorted coldly, picked up the teacup on the table and took 2 sips of tea, and said angrily, "In your heart, whatever Mr. Ye says is whatever it is. If I say it, you don't believe it? Okay, let this go in advance. The Privy Minister asked you to find a way to fill the gap. In this way, you can stay in the capital and assist the wise king." Lu Dinkin thought for a moment and shook his head in disapproval. "This matter needs further consideration." The British Duke impatiently interrupted Lu Dinkin, "I have already thought about it for you. What else are you considering? Is there anything else to consider? Or are you unwilling to contribute to the wise king, but to help Lu Zikin? I'll start with the ugly words. If you dare to help Lu Zikin, don't blame me for being ruthless and denying your son." Lu Dinkin looked up at the British father and asked, "Father, You keep saying that you have thought about it. How did you think about it? You want me to try to get the position of Privy Councillor. If I get this position, what happens next? Can you help the King of Sienne? Have your father ever thought about it? The British Duke was born into a military general, and what could a family of military generals do to gain a foothold? Has your father ever thought about it? What can make a family of military commanders stand is military power. If I stay in Beijing, will my military power have to be handed over? How much power can a general without military power have? The British government has a hereditary and irreplaceable government, and you have brought it to such a state. How long can this mansion survive if you hand over the military power? L.V. Dinkin's questions left the British Duke speechless. L.V. Dinkin's words made the British Duke suddenly wake up. He had only thought about helping the wise king to ascend the throne. He thought that as long as the wise king came to the throne, the British Duke's palace would be able to return to its former glory. He forgot that if he lost the military power, he would also lose the right to speak. Without waiting for the British public to speak, Lu Ninkin continued, the emperor has just passed the year of confusion, and the dragon body is healthy, not to the old dragon bell, sang Yamusin. Why did my father rush into the party struggle in such a hurry? When the emperor is in power, it is a serious crime to form cliques for personal gain. Doesn't father know? The British Duke couldn't stand being scolded by his son, and said with a straight face, how can this be called a private clique? The wise king is my grandson, what's wrong with me standing on his side and making plans for him? Lu Dinkin frowned and said, father has completely forgotten the instructions of our ancestors. The British Duke was speechless again. The ancestors of the Lu family have taught that the descendants of the Lu family are only loyal to the emperor on the throne and are not allowed to participate in party disputes. Seeing the British Duke bow his head and remain silent, Lu Ninkin sighed and said, my father should not have let Dingian enter the palace in the first place. If Dingian had not entered the palace, my father would not have had these thoughts. The British Duke said, the matter has come to this, what's the use of saying this? The good king is in a good situation now. We only need to give him a helping hand, and he will be able to ascend to that position. How can we just watch and not help him? He is an old man's grandson. End of this chapter. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 296. Chapter 296 How to Face It. Lu Dinkin didn't expect that even though he said a lot of earnest words, he still didn't let his father see the situation clearly. He couldn't help but feel a little discouraged, so he asked, what is father going to do with this helping hand? Hand over military power. The British public is also indecisive and doesn't know what to do. Seeing that his father was silent, Lu Dinkin continued, this choice is of vital importance to the British government. I said that when we hand over military power, we also hand over the right to speak. In the future, as long as we are slightly careless, the emperor can remove our officials just by giving him any excuse. The incident between Dingning and Xiren is the best evidence. Dingning was a minister of the Ministry of War, and Xiren was a deputy commander of the military and horse department. Together with the hereditary and irreplaceable titles of the British government, they were gone. The British Duke was startled and looked up at Lu Dinkin, do you know about this? L.V. Dinkin nodded, yes, I understand. The British Duke straightened up, looked at Lu Dinkin for a moment and asked, what do you think about this? Half a year has passed since the incident between Lu Dingning and Lu Xiren. Everything that happened that day was obviously so clever that it made people suspicious, but he had people check again and again, but they couldn't find any clues. Lu Dinkin looked at the British Duke and said, my father has been in Beijing for many years. How can he still not understand the affairs of the court? The matter between Dingning and Xiren was indecent and even shameful. But why did such a thing become so common in the city? Is there no driving force behind this? Father's letter? I don't believe it. I suspect that the woman who is entangled with Xiren and Dingning is most likely a chess piece in the hands of the other party, and her purpose is to target the wise king. Of course, this is my personal opinion. I have been away from Beijing for a long time, so I don't know much about the current situation in Beijing, and my speculations may not be reasonable. But one thing is certain, the emperor's punishment was a severe warning to the British government. In other words, the emperor is very likely to know what his father did. Otherwise, the emperor would not be able to give such a severe punishment. After hearing what Lu Dinkin said, the British Duke immediately shook his head and said, "Impossible. My people are doing things very secretly. How could the emperor know about it? Impossible, absolutely impossible." Lu Dinkin looked at the British Duke, who was waving his hands again and again, and said unceremoniously, "Is my father so secretive in everything he does? Why is my father so sure that the emperor doesn't know what you are doing? It's not that the British public doesn't believe it, it's that he doesn't want to believe it, so he denies it repeatedly." How did the emperor know? Lu Dinkin lowered his head and poured himself a cup of tea, took a sip, and then said slowly, "I don't know how the emperor knew. But it must be true that the emperor wants to rule the British government. Otherwise, Dingning and Xiren would not be able to lost his official position." The British Duke looked at Lu Dinkin and asked, "Tell me, what should we do in the current situation?" Lu Dinkin thought for a while and said, "Do what you should do, and don't think about things you shouldn't. You just don't want to help Jingxing. I know that you hate the Yang family. Although my wife and you are not the same mother, she is also your sister. Jingxing is your sire." Lu Dinkin waited for the British Duke to finish speaking, and then asked with a serious face, "Father, can you wait for me to finish speaking?" The British Duke said excitedly, "What is your attitude? Is there any other son like you?" Lu Dinkin sighed and said patiently, "Father, do you want to listen or not? If father doesn't listen, I will go back." Speaking, Lu Dinkin stood up. When the British Duke saw it, he pointed at Lu Dinkin and said, "Sit down with me." Lu Dinkin sat back and said, "Let's talk first, then I will speak. Father can't interrupt at will, otherwise I will leave immediately." The British Duke stopped talking. His son was no longer the young boy he was back then, but a commander leading thousands of troops. Lu Dinkin looked at the British Duke and continued, "Zi Qin has become the king of Qin. What is anxious is not just the virtuous king, but also the person who wants to sit in that position. At this time, the wise king should calm down. The most important thing is not to fight and grab, but to calm down and do the things at hand. The first is to let the emperor see the ability of the wise king, and the second is to let the emperor see the generosity of the wise king. Leave the fight for others to do. My father should understand that when Snipe and Clam fight, the fishermen will benefit." The British Duke remained silent. Lu Dinkin glanced at the British Duke and then said, "The emperor's princes are not only King Qin and King Xian, but besides them, there are 3 more." The British Duke nodded, "That's the truth. What if the other 3 think like you do, and don't they give King Qin a chance to breathe?" Lu Dinkin asked in surprise, "You didn't even give King Qin a chance to breathe? You have watched Zigzun grow up. He has lived in the British government for more than 20 years. Based on this, do you have the heart to attack him?" The British Duke glanced at Lu Dinkin and said, "You are still a general who commands thousands of armies, but you are also benevolent. Being kind to the enemy is cruel to yourself. If you want to blame him, you can only blame him for being born in the wrong child." Lu Dinkin said, "Are Jingxing and Zikan enemies?" "Before, they were cousins, but now, they are brothers connected by blood. From childhood to adulthood, Zikan always protected him, but Jing-Xing attacked Zikin, so he wasn't afraid of the world criticizing him. The British Duke disagreed and said, how can a person achieve great things if he looks forward and backward? Also, how do you know that Zikin will not attack Jing-Xing? If the royal family has no family ties, the winner will be the king and the loser will be the loser. You should understand this truth best. Lu Dinkin looked at the British Duke like a stranger. He felt that the British Duke was too crazy and was trying to lead the British Duke to a dead end. LV Dinkin took a deep breath to calm down. Father, have you ever thought about the consequences if things go wrong? The Queen has been dead for more than 20 years, why doesn't the Emperor establish a Queen? The Emperor has been searching for King Qin for more than 20 years. One can imagine the status of King Qin in the Emperor's heart. Before Zikin's life story was revealed, the Emperor treated him favorably. Now that he knows that Zikin is the king of Qin, will the Emperor allow others to hurt him? The British Duke said, so, we cannot give King Qin a chance to breathe. If we lose the opportunity, it will only be more difficult in the future. Lu Dinkin raised his hand and rubbed his temples, and said, Father, our views are inconsistent, and there is no result if we talk about it. That's it for today. Let's think about it carefully. We will discuss it again after we return to Beijing. Speaking, Lu Dinkin stood up and prepared to say goodbye and leave. The British Duke asked, what happened to the women and children you came back with? Lu Dinkin sat down again and said, those are his son's concubine and a pair of children. The Wang family is Wang Shuang, the daughter of Wang Kikun, Wangji County, Qi County. The children are twins. They are 8 years old this year. The son Lu Zilan is the elder brother and the daughter Lu Zixi is the younger sister. They were supposed to be brought over to pay homage to their father, but the father told them to keep quiet and let the son come alone to meet his father, so the son did not bring them over. When they return home, they will be brought to present to their father. The British Duke nodded, thought for a moment, and asked, does Ye know about Wang's affairs? Lu Dinkin scratched his head uncomfortably and said, Sister Shan doesn't know yet. My son plans to tell her after he goes back. The British Duke said calmly, Ye doesn't live in the mansion now. If you want to see her, you have to go to Qingqiu Duke's mansion to find her. Lu Dinkin only thought that Ye Shan did not want to get along with Mrs. Yang and return to the Qingqiu palace, so he did not take the British Duke's words seriously and nodded in response, my son knows, we have to travel for half a day today, and my son cannot stay for a long time. The British Duke waved his hand, go, you need to remember that the wise king is yours, and the British Duke's government and the wise king will both prosper and suffer. LV Dinkin nodded and said, my son understands. After saying that, Lu Dinkin bowed and left the room. After coming out of the inn, Lu Dinkin rode back to the camp. The king of Qin entered Gu Huayu's small courtyard and saw that there was no one in the courtyard, so he sat under the window and read a book. Gu Huayu came back from Mrs. Ping's yard and saw a moon-white figure sitting under the window. She felt happy and ran towards King Qin happily, Qinjian, when did you arrive? King Qin put down the book in his hand, stretched out his arms, and held Gu Huayu in his arms. He raised his hand and looked at his watch, it's 1/4 hour. Are you coming from the old lady's place? Gu Huayu sat on King Qin's lap and put her hand on King Qin's shoulder, yes, I had a conversation with my grandmother. Isn't there a banquet in Prince Qin's house today? It ended so early? How was it? Did it go well? Gu Huayu asked a series of questions. King Qin raised his hand and pinched Gu Huayu's nose, and smiled fondly, you ask so many questions at once, which one should I answer first? Before King Qin finished speaking, Gu Huayu raised her head, opened her mouth and took King Qin's index finger into her mouth, and gave King Qin a charming look with her delicate eyes. King Qin was so amused by Gu Huayu's bold and provocative movements that he couldn't help but swallow, retracted his hand, lowered his head and put his mouth towards her. After a while of kissing, King Qin let go of Gu Huayu and whispered in her ear, "Little fairy." The warm breath spread to Gu Huayu's neck, tickling her so much that she couldn't stop laughing, and said angrily, "It's not you who loves her." King Qin lowered his eyes and looked at the little goblin in his arms who was trembling with laughter. His heart softened and he said hoarsely, "Yes, they are all loved by me. Little goblin, don't be fearless, be careful as I will put you on the spot." Gu Huayu buried her face in King Qin's arms and quickly changed the subject. "Did the banquet go well today? Old Madame Yang didn't make things difficult for you, right?" King Qin looked at the little girl who was shrinking in fear, and the corners of his mouth could not help but raise, and said, "Fortunately, Mrs. Yang wanted to make things difficult, but shopkeeper Miao saw through it and didn't let her succeed." Gu Huayu sat up straight. The old woman is so brave. She dared to act wild at the banquet of Prince Jin's mansion. Tell me, what did she do to ruin it? King Qin told Mrs. Yang's story in detail. After hearing this, Gu Huayu sighed, "I'm afraid there is something wrong with the old woman's brain. Otherwise, how could she do such a brainless thing? The reputation of the British government has been ruined by her." King Qin asked, "Does the British government still have a reputation?" Gu Huayu said with a smile, "That's right, the British government has long been notorious." Gu Huayu leaned back on King Qin's shoulder and played with King Qin's wide sleeves. King Qin lowered his head, rubbed Gu Huayu's forehead with his face, and said, "Huarujun came to the palace today." Gu Huayu stopped what she was doing, looked up at King Qin, and asked in shock, "Who? Qinjian, who did you say went to the palace?" King Qin looked down at Gu Huayu and replied, "Huarujun." Gu Huayu sat up straight and asked, "Why did he go to the palace? Who did he go with?" "King Xian." The king of Qin admired Gu Huayu's keenness, nodded and said, "I came with the Xian king." For this reason, Lu Zixun and Lu Dingning are still dissatisfied with the Xian king. Feeling dissatisfied, there's internal strife. What's going on? The king of Qin explained the matter in a few words. After hearing this, Gu Huayu said, "Interesting, the wise king asked Huarujun to be a bodyguard. Why did the wise king ask him to be a bodyguard? Why is Huarujun willing to be a bodyguard? There must be some transaction that we don't know about." King Qin nodded, he thought so too. Gu Huayu asked, "Qinjian, have you asked someone to check it?" King Qin replied, "I have asked Rugjuan to inquire about it. By the way, there is one more thing." Gu Huayu raised her head and looked at King Qin, "Is there anything else? How many things are you going to do at this banquet?" King Qin smiled and said, "I didn't want it either. Things just came to me like this, and I was helpless." "What's up?" King Qin suppressed his smile and said seriously, "Uncle is back." Seeing King Qin's solemn expression, Gu Huayu stopped joking, sat up straight, and said seriously, "I know this. As you said before, he will return to Beijing to report on his work this year." "What? I don't know how to face him." King Qin shook his head, "It's not that I'm afraid of facing him." "What's that for?" Gu Huayu asked with concern. King Qin let out a breath and said, "The British prince took people to meet him the day before yesterday. I asked people to go and find out." Seeing King Qin stop, Gu Huayu looked embarrassed and asked, "What did you find out?" "The spies came back and said that there was a woman and a son and a daughter in the group accompanying my uncle." Gu Huayu opened her eyes in shock and blurted out, "Qinjian, what do you mean?" From the look on King Qin's face, Gu Huayu had already guessed the result, but she didn't dare to believe it, and she didn't want to believe it. She has been treating Mrs. Ye these days and has gotten closer to Mrs. Ye. She feels that Mrs. Ye has a deep love for Lu Dinkin. Mrs. Ye has come to this day with her love for Lu Dinkin. King Qin did not look back at Huayu, but looked at her with a bit of sadness in his eyes. Gu Huayu met King Qin's gaze and asked suspiciously, the prince has taken a concubine, and the concubine has given birth to a pair of children for him. King Qin stretched out his hand to hug Gu Huayu closer, then rested his head on Gu Huayu's shoulder, and said with a sense of loneliness, I will ask people to go and inquire again. However, the number of women and children who can accompany them should be 8-9 is inseparable. Gu Huayu instantly understood King Qin's mood, tilted her head to lean against King Qin's, and said softly, if this is the case, how sad will Madame be? The prince is stabbing Madame in the heart. It's really worthless to be a wife. She fell in love with a man who didn't have herself in her heart. She stayed with him for more than 20 years, and these were still the 20 years when she was the most youthful. How many 20 years can a life last? End of this chapter. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 297. Chapter 297 Boldness. King Qin leaned against Gu Huayu, sighed heavily and said nothing. Gu Huayu asked, Qinjian, if the information we get back is as we think, what are you going to do? King Qin shook his head slightly and said helplessly, ever since I heard the news, my heart has been filled with panic. Other than feeling sorry for my aunt, I don't know what to do. Xiao, I feel so useless. King Qin's words made Gu Huayu feel heartbroken. She raised her hand to touch King Qin's face and said comfortingly, Qinjian, don't blame yourself, this matter is not something you can control. Things like parents' feelings are difficult for everyone, and it makes people powerless and helpless. Parental love is the greatest luck for a child. Discord between parents is a permanent pain in a child's heart. King Qin sighed slightly and said, my aunt was determined to marry the crown prince despite my grandmother's objection. Over the years, my aunt has. Living in the British government was on tenterhooks. Xiao, that feeling is suffocating. Gu Huayu nodded and said, Qinjian, I can understand that my wife has been in the British government for more than 20 years. In addition to a widowed marriage, she also has to face a vicious stepmother who never makes her feel better. King Qin nodded, yes, if my maternal family wasn't stronger and my father favored my maternal family, my aunt would have died many times in the British palace. Gu Huayu said in confusion, the prince has taken concubines before, but madam. The prince's previous concubinage was arranged by the old lady. The British government is a home of military commanders, and they attach great importance to their heirs. The aunt was married and had not had children for a long time. The old lady used this as an excuse to take a concubine for the prince. The purpose of taking a concubine was to spread her business, so the aunt had no choice but to accept it. Old woman Yang was too sinister. While drinking Jweza soup for Mrs. she arranged for Lu Dinkin to take in concubines. Gu Huayu felt aggrieved for Mrs. just thinking about it, and felt sorry for her. Gu Huayu asked, Qinjian, what kind of person is the crown prince? King Qin thought for a while and said, how should I put it? He is at the border all year round, and I don't spend much time with him. But when he got along with me, he treated me very well. He would check my homework, play with me, and tell me some principles of life like an ordinary father would. To me, he tried his best to be a good father. As for the rest, I can't make a judgment. Being able to gain the approval of the almost perfect king of Qin, Gu Huayu can roughly imagine that even if Lu Dinkin is not a perfect man, he is still a very charming man. This is probably why King Qin is sad. Lu Dinkin and Mrs. are like parents to King Qin. Both of them are very important in King Qin's heart. Even though Lu Dinkin was away from home all year round, he still held a very important position in the heart of King Qin. If Lu Dinkin is a scumbag, King Qin only needs to deal with him in a big way and vent his anger on Mrs. behalf. Gu Huayu said, as children, we can't get involved in the emotional affairs of our parents. We can only respect their choices. No matter what the wife chooses, we will stand behind her and accompany her through the trough of life. King Qin straightened up and looked at Gu Huayu. He knew that she was his little Sunday. Talk to her and the haze in your heart will dissipate. Seeing him looking at her blankly, Gu Huayu asked, "What's wrong? Did I say something wrong?" King Qin shook his head, held Gu Huayu's face with both hands, lowered his head and pressed it against her forehead and whispered softly, "Xiao, thank you." Gu Huayu put her arms around King Qin's body and said, "No matter what the result is, you can't mess up the situation. You were raised by my wife, and you are my greatest support." After hearing Gu Huayu's words, King Qin was moved beyond words. He raised his hand and hugged Gu Huayu tightly into his arms. After a long time, he said softly, "Xiao, thank you." Gu Huayu looked up at King Qin and said with a smile, "Thank you for what? We should have supported each other and moved forward." King Qin looked at Gu Huayu, couldn't help but lowered his head and kissed Gu Huayu's forehead, and said softly, "Xiao, it's great to have you." Gu Huayu winked playfully at King Qin and said arrogantly, "Of course." King Qin looked at the bright and dazzling little guy, and his heart was filled to the brim. God was so fond of him that he sent the little guy to him. "What's wrong?" Gu Huayu asked when she saw King Qin looking at her in a daze again. King Qin recovered his thoughts and replied truthfully, "God has been kind to me, so he sent you to me. I will spend my whole life to pamper you and love you." "Okay, why are you talking about the eternal oath of eternal love?" King Qin corrected him, "This is not a sworn oath, it is just a sentiment. I want you to know what I am thinking at this moment." Gu Huayu read the treasure from King Qin's affectionate eyes, and her eyes were filled with tenderness. "Qinjian, me too." King Qin held Gu Huayu's face and asked, "What is it?" Gu Huayu met King Qin's gaze and replied seriously, "I will spend my whole life to pamper you and love you." The king of Qin lowered his head and sealed Gu Huayu's mouth. For a long time, Gu Huayu remained motionless in King Qin's arms. It was not until the two men's breaths calmed down that they got up from King Qin's arms, turned around, walked to the soft couch and sat down. King Qin followed, sat down next to Gu Huayu, raised his hand, poured a cup of tea and handed it to Gu Huayu. "Here, have a cup of tea." "Thank you." Gu Huayu reached over to take the teacup. The teacup was halfway handed to him but King Qin withdrew it. Gu Huayu looked at King Qin doubtfully, with a puzzled face. King Qin said seriously, "Xiao Yu, you have forgotten my words again, you deserve to be punished." Gu Huayu immediately understood. King Qin had warned her before that between them, he should do anything for her, and she couldn't thank him. Gu Huayu suddenly wanted to know how King Qin would punish her if she made a mistake. She wanted to test his bottom line. Having thought about it, Gu Huayu asked, "Qinjian, how do you want to punish me?" "How to punish?" King Qin was stunned by Gu Huayu's words. "Yes, how to punish?" King Qin stared at Gu Huayu's delicate little face, from the sly smile, the smart eyes, the straight and full bridge of the nose, to the plump lips. King Qin suddenly felt blessed. He picked up the teacup and took a sip of tea in his mouth. He put down the teacup, hugged Gu Huayu and pressed him under him. He put the tea in his mouth into Gu Huayu's mouth. He raised his head and said, "This is the punishment. From now on, as long as you thank me, I will punish you like this. Little guy, are you satisfied?" King Qin performed a set of movements smoothly and in one go. By the time Gu Huayu reacted, the tea had already been swallowed by herself. Gu Huayu was so shocked that she half opened her mouth and looked at King Qin with wide open eyes. She thought that King Qin would punish her by doing laundry, cooking, squatting, or hitting her palms. She never imagined that he would punish her like this. King Qin looked at Gu Huayu, who was stunned and speechless, and asked softly, "How is it? Have you remembered it? If not, let's try it again." As he said that, King Qin sat up straight and went to pick up the teacup again. Gu Huayu jumped up in fright, waved her hands hurriedly and said, "Kinjian, stop, I remember." Gu Huayu couldn't play such an ambiguous and exciting trick. Even though the two of them talked about love when they were together, and even kissed each other and drank each other's saliva when they were deeply in love, she still couldn't accept such a serious matter of feeding tea by mouth. This, thinking about it, made her blush and her heart beat. It was too ambiguous, too provocative, and a little too immoral. When King Qin saw Gu Huayu jumping far away, he put down the cup in his hand and asked, "Remember?" Gu Huayu nodded repeatedly, "Remember." King Qin nodded with satisfaction, "Just remember it? What are you doing so far away from me? Sit here." King Qin patted the place beside him as he spoke. Gu Huayu looked at the teacup and then at King Qin. King Qin followed Gu Huayu's gaze and looked at the teacup, and asked, "Are you afraid? Sit over here, I won't feed you anymore." Gu Huayu said, "You promise?" King Qin nodded, "I promise." Gu Huayu slowly moved to sit next to King Qin after receiving King Qin's assurance. As soon as Gu Huayu sat down, King Qin held her in his arms, pushed her onto the soft couch with his backhand, came closer and asked, "Little one, do you dislike me?" Gu Huayu looked at the enlarged handsome face, swallowed, shook her head and said, "No." King Qin stared into Gu Huayu's eyes and asked, "Really?" Gu Huayu nodded, "Really? Then why are you hiding far away?" "Huh?" King Qin asked. Gu Huayu raised her hands and put her arms around King Qin's neck, pulled him close to her, and whispered to him, "Don't you think that action is too provocative?" To tease people?" King Qin asked. Gu Huayu gently bit King Qin's earlobe and said softly, "Yes, it's very sultry." King Qin's whole body was trembling, and his face instantly turned red to the roots of his ears. Gu Huayu noticed that King Qin's face was hot and wanted to turn her head to take a look. King Qin warned in a low voice, "Little guy, the king has recorded this in the account book. One day, I will get back the capital with interest." After saying that, King Qin got up from Gu Huayu and hurried to the bathroom. Gu Huayu was lying on the soft couch, thinking about what she was talking about, and raised her hand to cover her mouth in fright. She must have been stunned just now, so she bit his ear and said such words. Gu Huayu blushed with embarrassment, turned over and sat up, looked up at the bathroom, wondering if she should take the opportunity to escape quickly. Gu Huayu has always been an action person. Thinking like this, she got up and walked out. But after taking a few steps, a very magnetic voice sounded behind her, "Xiao, where are you going?" Gu Huayu turned to look at King Qin and said sheepishly, "I'm not going anywhere. I seemed to hear some noise outside and wanted to take a look." When King Qin saw her averting her eyes and looking uneasy, he felt at ease. The little guy speaks freely when he is bold, but when he regains consciousness, he wants to be a deserter. King Qin walked towards Gu Huayu and said, "Really? I'll go and have a look with you." Gu Huayu wanted to say no, she could just go and see for herself. King Qin had already passed her and moved forward, so she had to follow him towards the door. The two of them walked to the door and stuck their heads out to take a look. There was no figure outside the door. Gu Huayu touched her head uncomfortably and said, "It seems that I just heard something wrong." King Qin did not expose her. He put his hand on her shoulder and carried her back. "Let's go back and sit down. Let's discuss my aunt's affairs." Gu Huayu turned to look at King Qin. King Qin felt her gaze coming towards him and looked sideways. Gu Huayu saw King Qin looking over and quickly looked forward to avoid King Qin's burning eyes. Seeing her hiding from him, King Qin strengthened his hand a little more. "What's wrong? Are you afraid of me?" Gu Huayu quickly shook her head, "Don't be afraid." King Qin lowered his head and asked, "I'm really not afraid." Gu Huayu met King Qin's probing eyes and changed her words, "Afraid." King Qin turned Gu Huayu around, looked at her with a half smile and asked, Are you afraid or not? Gu Huayu was anxious when asked by the king of Qin. She held her little pink fist to greet him, and while beating her, she said coquettishly, "You bad guy, you know how to bully me." King Qin stretched out his hand to hold Gu Huayu's hand, hugged her into his arms, and laughed. Gu Huayu was a little annoyed at first, but then found it funny, and started laughing. The two of them laughed like two idiots and couldn't stand upright. Gu Huayu laughed so hard that tears came out. She touched her tears and said, "I can't do it anymore. My stomach hurts from laughing." King Qin smiled and helped Gu Huayu to the soft couch, helped Gu Huayu wipe the corners of her eyes, suppressed the laughter and said, "Okay, enough laughing, stop laughing." Gu Huayu nodded in agreement, "Okay, stop laughing." They were talking, but they couldn't help it. The two laughed for a while. They stopped laughing when they were tired and had enough. King Qin bent down and poured 2 cups of tea, and handed one to Gu Huayu, "Drink some tea." Gu Huayu took the teacup, and the word "thank you" almost rolled out of her mouth. Gu Huayu looked at King Qin and quickly swallowed it back. King Qin couldn't help but raise the corners of his mouth when he saw Gu Huayu lowering her head to sip tea. He reached out to pick up the teacup in front of him and took 2 sips of tea. Gu Huayu put down the teacup, looked up at King Qin, and asked, "Qinjian, are you going to tell Madam about the prince's concubine?" King Qin thought for a while and shook his head, "I think you are right. I don't want to get involved in this matter and let my aunt make her own decision. No matter what her choice is, I will stand by her side and be her support." Gu Huayu nodded, "Well, we are not Madam. Without her experience, we cannot empathize with her feelings. Everything is up to Madam, and we only need to stand behind Madam to support her." Just as King Qin was about to say something, there were rapid footsteps outside the door. Gu Huayu and King Qin looked at each other quickly, and then turned their eyes to the door. I saw Lonicera walking in quickly with a panicked expression. When Lonicera saw the King of Qin, he was stunned for a moment, and then he bowed his knees and bowed to the King of Qin. King Qin nodded slightly. Gu Huayu asked, "What happened?" Landong bowed to Gu Huayu and said, "Back to the princess, Hongxia just came back to report that something happened to the second young lady." Gu Huayu stood up and walked out, saying, "Qinjian, I'm going to Daowen Street to have a look." King Qin followed him out and said, "Don't worry, I'll go too, and we'll split up." Gu Huayu knew that King Qin would not stand idly by, so she nodded and said, "Okay. See you later." King Qin warned, "Don't worry, I will take care of everything. Do you understand?" Gu Huayu nodded, "Okay, I know." End of this chapter. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 298. Chapter 298 Fight Back. Gu Huayu followed Lonicera to the front yard, and King Qin went out from the back door. When Rugjuan saw King Qin coming out, he quickly raised the curtain. King Qin got on the carriage and said to Rugjuan, "Go to Daowen Street." Rugjuan nodded and said, "Yes, I understand." On the other side, Gu Huayu and Liandong went to the front yard. Wang Qin and Sui Er were asking about Gu Chengwan. When the 3 of them saw Gu Huayu coming, they greeted Gu Huayu and said, "Princess." Gu Huayu nodded and asked, "What's wrong with the second sister?" Hongxia bent her knees and said, "Back to the princess." A woman named Wang Suimei came to the door with her maid and mother-in-law. When she entered the door, she looked for the second young lady. "We just treat it as a guest who comes to ask for the second lady to explain. The second lady is very capable. Since the shop opened, many people have come to ask for the second lady to explain. Therefore, everyone did not take it seriously." Unexpectedly, after the second lady passed by, Wang Suimei brought those women who rushed up to her and pushed her to the ground without saying a word, and then punched and kicked her. When the slaves rushed over, the second lady had already been beaten by those people. "I can't stand up anymore." The servant hurriedly came back to report to the princess. Gu Huayu asked, "Have you reported to the official?" Hongxia shook her head and said, "When I came, I had not reported to the official yet." "Princess, the car is ready." Qingyu stood at the door and shouted. Gu Huayu nodded and said to Hongxia, "Get in the car first and talk while walking." "You two together?" Liwa and Begonia bent their knees and said, "Yes." Sui-er said to Wang Qin, "You stay in the house, I will go with the princess to have a look." Wang Qin nodded and said, "Okay, take good care of the princess." Gu Huayu got into the car and asked, "What's the problem between this man named Wang and the second sister?" Hongxia shook her head and said, "I don't quite understand. Those women beat the second young lady while cursing them. They said they were little hooves and whores, and they dared to rob their uncle and so on." Gu Huayu's brows knitted when she heard this, and she asked, "What man does the second sister have contact with?" Hongxia shook her head, "I don't know, the second lady has just returned to the capital. She has been busy preparing fragrant dew in the shop these days and rarely walks out. When that group of people came to the door today, the second lady happened to bring the prepared incense to the door." Gu Huayu raised the curtains and said to Sui-er, who was riding beside him, "Let someone go and find out where this Wang Sui comes from." Sui-er leaned forward and said, "Back to the princess, I've asked Zhengzhen to check." Gu Huayu nodded, lowered the curtain, looked at Hongxia and asked, "Did any man look for her in the shop before the second sister returned to Xishan?" Hongxia thought for a while and said, "Before the second young lady returned to Xishan, there was a man named Huang who often came to the shop. After Mr. Huang came, he would always chat and laugh with the second young lady." Gu Huayu's expression became solemn and asked, "Second sister is very enthusiastic about this Mr. Huang?" Hongxia shook her head, "That's not true. As long as people come to the shop, no matter men, women, old or young, second miss is the same, very proactive and enthusiastic. What second miss often talks about is what the princess used to say. Every visitor is a guest, and everyone should be treated equally regardless of their status." Gu Huayu nodded, and then asked, "That person named Huang, does he buy things every time he comes back?" Hongxia thought for a while and said, "No, when the second lady is here, he will buy two of the same thing. If the second lady is not here, he will just leave." Hearing this, Gu Huayu had an idea in her mind. She raised the curtain and said to Sui-er, "Let someone go check on this person named Huang." Sui-er nodded in agreement, "Yes, I understand." Gu Huayu turned to Liwa and Haitang and said, "Go in later. If the other party hasn't left yet, let's not worry about anything else and fight back first. If there's anything else, we'll discuss it after the fight is over. You two follow my instructions, do you understand?" Liwa and Haitang nodded and said, "Okay, I understand." As the carriage turned into Daowen Street, Qingyu said, "Princess, there are many people around the door of the shop. Should we enter through the front door or the backyard?" Gu Huayu said, "Enter through the front door and yell loudly twice, saying that the boss is here. How can you be quiet when someone comes to bully you? We have to regain our place in a high-profile manner." Qingyu responded, "Okay, I understand." Qingyu drove the car over and shouted, "Give way, everyone, please give way, our boss is here." When the onlookers heard that the boss was coming, they automatically stood on both sides. Standing on tiptoes and craning their necks, they looked here and there, curious as to what their boss would do. Qingyu parked the car at the entrance of the shop, quickly put the footrest in place, leaned forward and raised the curtain, "Princess, please get out of the car." Liwa got out of the car first, turned around and reached out to hold Gu Huayu's hand. Gu Huayu put her hand on Liwa's and stepped on the footstool to get out of the car step by step. After Gu Huayu got out of the car, She paused at the door and looked around to see if there was anyone suspicious. She saw King Chin's carriage across the street. King Chin saw her looking over and waved to her. Gu Huayu nodded slightly, then turned around and walked into the shop. Two women were guarding the door. When they saw Gu Huayu approaching, they bent their knees and said, "Princess. Is the owner of the shop really the princess?" Someone in the crowd asked. "I also heard that this shop is opened by Princess Yan Ran. It seems that this is Princess Yan Ran. Who is the person who beat someone? How dare you come to the princess's shop to cause trouble? It must be a big deal." Gu Huayu stood at the door and looked into the house. The shop was in a mess. A woman in purple clothes stood on the side with her hands folded on her chest. Behind her stood a dozen strong women and two maids. Looking at it like this, the woman in purple has no intention of leaving, but is waiting for her. On the other side, Wan Xiaoshuang, Chao Yang and several shop assistants guarded Gu Chengwan, who was lying on the ground. When Wan Xiaoshuang saw Gu Huayu arriving, she wanted to go forward and complain to Gu Huayu, but Chao Yang pulled her back. Wan Xiaoshuang looked back at Chao Yang, who shook his head slightly at her. Wan Xiaoshuang understood, stood where he was, followed Chao Yang and several other men to greet Gu Huayu, "Princess." Gu Huayu nodded slightly, stepped forward, and knelt down to examine Gu Chengwan. When Gu Chengwan saw Gu Huayu, she groaned and called out, "Xiao." Gu Huayu stuffed a pill into Gu Chenjuan's mouth like a magic trick and said, "Close your eyes and get some sleep." The maid behind Wang Suimei asked, "Miss, people have seen it, shall we go?" Wang Suimei nodded and said, "Okay, let's go." Seeing Wang Suimei nod, the maid and her mother-in-law nodded, and a group of people cheered towards the door, preparing to leave. Gu Huayu stood up and said, "Miss Wang, our accounts haven't been settled yet, so there's no need to leave in a hurry." Wang Suimei stopped and looked at Gu Huayu with disdain. "Princess Yan Ran, your man seduced me and went to your fiancé. I'm here to seek justice. I should come to you to settle this debt." Gu Huayu put her tongue against the back alveolar and looked at Wang Suimei sideways, knowing where she came from, as expected. Gu Huayu walked towards Wang Suimei and said as she walked, "Miss, please don't talk nonsense. A person with a red mouth and white teeth must have evidence for what he says. Catch thieves and stolen goods, and catch cheaters and couples. Miss, you said my man seduced your fiancé, where is the evidence?" The mother-in-law behind Wang Suimei saw Gu Huayu approaching, and stepped forward to block Wang Suimei, protecting Wang Suimei behind her. Wang Suimei felt that the mother-in-law was blocking her view, so she moved a step to the side, stared at Gu Huayu and said, "My man looked at the foxy girl talking and laughing with him." When the old woman stood forward, Gu Huayu raised her hand and waved her hand, and a silver needle immediately flew into her body. The mother-in-law stood there unable to move as if someone had cast a spell on her. Gu Huayu patted her mother-in-law on the shoulder and said, "Don't be nervous, I'll just say a few words to your lady." The other wives saw Gu Huayu's movements and immediately became nervous. They stared at Gu Huayu and stepped forward to protect Wang Suimei one by one. Liwa, Begonia, King Yu, and Sui Er didn't know when they had stood next to Gu Huayu. Gu Huayu said, "Hit me. Pay attention to the severity, don't beat me to death." As soon as Gu Huayu finished speaking, Sui Er and others took action. Gu Huayu stepped aside and raised her voice, "By the way, I want this young lady to break 2 ribs, 1 arm and 1 leg." Liwa responded, "I understand." Seeing that Sui Er and the others were very skilled, a woman raised her voice and said, "Miss, run quickly." Wang Suimei's face changed with fright. After listening to her mother-in-law's words, she ran towards the door. Liwa struck the woman who was clinging to him with one palm, turned around and did a backflip to stop in front of Wang Suimei, and then swept out with one leg. With a click, Wang Suimei fell to her knees, and Wang Suimei let out a pig-killing cry. A rear projection pressed down, and Wang Suimei lay on the ground unable to move. Liwa touched Wang Suimei, stood up like a carp, and said to Gu Hua, "Princess, can I have 3 ribs and 1 leg?" The corner of Gu Huayu's mouth twitched, she nodded, and said, "That's okay." Liwa put away her fists and stood aside, and Sui-er and the others also put away their hands and stood aside. Gu Huayu looked at the maid and woman who were complaining with satisfaction, then turned to Wan Xiaoshuang and the others and said, "I'll give you 2/4 of an hour to sort out the damaged goods in the shop." Wan Xiaoshuang, Chao Yang, Hengxia, and a few guys went to work immediately. Gu Huayu turned to King Yu and said, "Go find a rope, stretch these people, and send them to the yamen in a while. By the way, remember to buy some hemp kernels to stuff their mouths. It's too noisy and annoying." King Yu bowed down and went out to buy a rope. Gu Huayu asked Liwa and Haitang to carry Gu Chengwan to the rest room. After sending Liwa and Haitang out, she began to treat Gu Chengwan. The people at the door were shocked by the front row, and they couldn't say a word. A fight, who has the upper hand? Which side won the battle? King Yu came back very quickly. When he came back, in addition to 2 bundles of ropes in his hands, there was also the king of Qin behind him. Sui-er saw King Qin coming in and stepped forward to bow to him. The king of Qin waved his hand slightly, indicating that he did not need to be polite. He opened his mouth and asked, "Where is Xiao?" Sui-er leaned over and replied, "Go back to your lord, the princess is treating the second lady. Your lord, please go to the living room and wait for the princess." Gu Huayu came out of the lounge, saw King Qin, and said, "Why did you come in?" King Qin said, "I'm worried, so I came in to take a look. Is Miss Gu seriously injured?" Gu Huayu nodded and said, "It's heavy. 1 leg was broken and 2 ribs were broken. The loss is not in vain, so I had Wang Suimei beaten and took away 1 of her legs and 3 ribs." King Qin looked at Gu Huayu and said, "You went up to beat her yourself? Does your hand hurt from the beating?" Sui-er next to him was shocked by King Qin's question and couldn't help but look over. "Damn, is there anyone so doting?" Gu Huayu twitched the corner of her mouth and said, "This Wang Suimei looks pretty good at first glance. I thought you would blame me for being reckless." King Qin said, "What are you afraid of? I'm here. As I said, you can walk sideways and I will clean up the trouble you cause." Gu Huayu smiled, her eyebrows arched, and said, "Okay." Sui-er couldn't listen anymore and quietly retreated. Gu Huayu took a sip of water and said sternly, "Wang Suimei knew that I owned this shop, and yet she dared to bring people to the door to cause trouble. The background is not small. The person fought back and got angry, and maybe she got into trouble." King Qin stretched out his hand to refill Gu Huayu's tea and said, "It's her fault, she came here to cause trouble. The reason is on our side, even if we go to the father, we are also right. The most important thing is to relieve my anger, I like you this way of handling it." Gu Huayu smiled and nodded, "I like it too. The best way to relieve anger is to fight back on the spot, so I have to fight back even though I know it will cause trouble. Instead of looking for opportunities to do evil things afterwards. I think that method is not fair enough." King Qin nodded and said, "Yes, I understand. Don't worry about trouble. I'm here." Gu Huayu said, "You don't need to step forward, I will solve it myself. If I can't solve it, it's not too late for you to take action." "Princess, Zhengzhen is back." After inquiring about the news, King Yu came over and reported. Gu Huayu turned to the door and said, "Let him come in." Zhengzhen went in and asked for a courtesy. Gu Hua said, "No need to be polite, who is Wang Suimei?" Zhengzhen leaned forward and said, "Back to the princess, Wang Suimei is the granddaughter of Wang Dengke, the Minister of Rites. Her father, Wang Zhouquan, serves in Taikang Temple. Wang Suimei's mother is the daughter of Yang and Haofu. Wang Suimei arranged to marry Huang Zhengyi, the grandson of Privy Councillor Huang, last year. Mr. Huang often visited our shop before. By the way, Wang Suimei's aunt is the eldest princess of Qing'an. Gu Huayu nodded, I understand, go down and see if they have sorted out the damaged goods. Let them report it after that. Zhengzhen bowed down and stepped back with his hands down. Gu Huayu looked at King Qin and asked, the eldest princess of Qing'an is the emperor's sister? What is their relationship like? King Qin nodded, yes, the relationship is relatively close. If the eldest princess of Qing'an is in the capital, she will often go into the palace to talk to her father. The eldest princess of Qing'an has only one daughter, and she was named Zaiwan County by her father when she was very young. Host. This is also the only one among the children of the eldest princess who has been given a title by his father. Wan Xiaoshuang came in and reported, Xiao, we found out that a total of 32 bottles of Wanzhou were damaged, each bottle was 68 taels, and the loss was 2,176 taels. 42 bottles of Nuaniang, each worth 90 taels, a loss of 3,780 taels. 15 bottles of liquid foundation cost 5 taels of silver each, a loss of 75 taels. 12 boxes of rouge, each containing 3 taels, resulted in a loss of 36 taels, and a total loss of 6,067 taels of silver. This is only the loss of goods, excluding damaged tables, chairs, and other items. End of this chapter. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 299. Chapter 299 A Clear Threat. Gu Huayu said, I know, have everyone in the Wang family loaded onto the carriage. Wan Xiaoshuang nodded and said, yes, they were all thrown into the carriage and loaded into 4 full carriages. Gu Huayu said, I'll go to Liwa and Hengxia and stay here. You and they will stay here. Don't tidy up the house for the time being. Let the house remain as it is so that people from the yamen can come to check. I will take people to the yamen to complain. Okay, I get it. Wan Xiaoshuang stepped back, and Gu Huayu turned to look at King Qin, I will handle this matter, you don't need to get involved. Your affairs are my affairs, how can I ignore it? Xiao, don't push me away when something happens, okay. The king of Qin was a little anxious. Gu Huayu shook her head and said, Qinjian, you misunderstood, I'm not pushing you away, we are dividing labor and cooperating. Intuitively, I feel that this matter is not simple. You think about it, Wang Suimei is a lady after all, and she is not a shrew in the market, so why would she just bring people to her door without any care, shouting to beat her and kill her? I think there may be someone behind this incident. Qinjian, you listen to me on this matter. I stand in the light and you keep an eye on me in the dark. Let's see if any suspicious people come to the yamen to inquire. King Qin thought for a while and nodded in agreement. Okay. Do as you say. Gu Huayu led a group of people to the gate of Jingzhou Mansion. Gu Huayu said to Sui Er, go and play the drum. It's already the end of the day, and it's time to go to the yamen in just one more stick of incense. The people in the yamen were tidying up, sitting or standing chatting, waiting for the time to go to the yamen. But at this moment, I heard the sound of grievance drums that I least wanted to hear. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked at each other. After a while, someone asked, is this someone playing a drum? Someone replied with great displeasure, no doubt, it's the sound of drums. Damn it, I hate hearing this sound at this point the most. Hearing the sound of drums means that they cannot go to the office on time. Who would be happy? The high official said to his subordinates, go and have a look. Before I could go out, the concierge had already come in and reported, sir, Princess Yanran has come to report to the official. Someone reacted quickly and asked, who? The porter replied, Princess Yanran. Gao Tuiguan and Lu Fuyan looked at each other quickly, and then asked, do you know why the princess came to report to the official? The porter shook his head and said, I don't know, but the princess and her party came with 6 carriages and blocked the door. Many people gathered to watch, and I heard faint groans. The high official looked at Lu Fuyan and asked, Sir, what do you think? Lu Fuyan said, everyone is already here, what else are you looking at? Get ready to go to the palace. Castus the order to his subordinates, prepare to ascend to the throne. The subordinates retreated and shouted about the matter of ascending to the throne. Even though Lu Fuyan was prepared, when he sat in the hall and looked at the rows of maids and women lying on the ground tied up, he was still shocked and speechless. After a long time, he asked, Princess, what is going on? Gu Huayu pointed at the group of people on the ground, Sir, this group of people is arrogant and lawless. In the capital city under the emperor's feet, they dared to go to Daowen Street in broad daylight to smash and rob, and even injured the clerk in my shop. Destroying the items in my shop. Gu Huayu's words were precise, sonorous, and powerful. Lu Fuyan frowned slightly. The other person had already used his usual words once he opened his mouth, and he said them loudly. Lu Fuyan pointed to the people on the ground and said, they injured the princess's clerk? Why don't I think it's right? What's the matter with the injuries on their bodies? Gu Huayu said, this is what my nursing home did after receiving the call for help from the shop. Mr. Lu, the reason why I say they are arrogant is because of this. My family lives in Wuitong Lane. It takes more than a quarter of an hour to get from Daowen Street to Wuitong Lane. After the incident, my people rushed from Daowen Street to Wuitong Lane to report the incident, and then I rushed from Wuitong Lane to Daowen Street. It took more than half an hour to go back and forth. When I arrived at the shop, they were still shouting in the shop. Lu Fuyan looked at the wounded on the ground and asked, Your Majesty, you want me to do something for you by playing the drum today? When Gu Huayu heard this, she felt unhappy and said with a sullen face, as the governor of Jingzhou Prefecture, what you said is a bit inappropriate. What do you mean by doing something for me? What is the difference between them and lawless bandits? When something like this happens at the emperor's feet, shouldn't the governor have any involvement? What a clear-minded and articulate girl, he made her grasp the topic with a casual word. Lu Fuyan was choked and annoyed by Gu Huayu's words, and said, Don't be angry, princess, this is the process of questioning. The princess is the one who suffers, so I naturally have to ask the princess what she thinks. Furthermore, when asking a question, you can't just listen to one side of the story. After listening to the princess's statement, I also need to look at the other side's arguments. Only based on the words of both parties, and looking at the witnesses, exhibits, and other evidence of both parties, can we judge who is right and who is wrong. The questions always come one at a time, right? After the princess has finished her statement, I will naturally ask the other party. Gu Huayu stepped aside and said, I don't know who the other person is. What grudge does he have against me? Why did he come to my shop to cause trouble? Sir, you asked, I was listening from the side. It is not easy for me to make a living alone. I cannot suffer losses for no reason, and my people cannot be bullied for no reason. Your Excellency, as the father-in-law of the people of the capital, I want you to give me justice. If I can't get justice from your lord, I will go to the palace to find the emperor and ask the emperor to make a decision for me. In the following sentences, Gu Huayu sounded pitiful, yet full of threats. If others dare to speak like this, Lu Fuyan will definitely have someone slap him. But this person in front of me was given a fish charm by the emperor, and she was the second person who could come and go freely in the palace. Gu Huayu made the threat clear, but Lu Fuyan did not back down at all, so he could only nod his head and said, Princess, Don't worry, I will judge the case fairly and justly, ask for the reasons, and give justice to the princess. Gu Huayu said, thank you, sir. Please ask me. Lu Fuyan looked at Gao Tuiguan. Gao Tuiguan stood up and walked to the lobby, walking straight to the woman in purple. Gu Huayu saw the high-ranking official walking toward Wang Suimei and said, Master Gao, this person may not be able to speak for a while. Why? The high-ranking official turned around and asked. Gu Huayu raised her chin and said, this man was seriously injured and fainted. The high official straightened up and asked, does the princess know which family this young lady belongs to? Gu Huayu shook her head, I don't know, I've been in the capital not long ago and I know very few people. Mr. Gao can choose someone with less serious injuries to ask. Oh, by the way, they screamed so noisily that I had people put pits in their mouths. If adults wanted to ask questions, they had to take the pits out of their mouths. The high official exchanged glances with Lu Fuyan quickly, selected the woman who seemed to have the least injuries, and had the hemp core removed from her mouth, and then removed the hemp rope from her body. This woman was the first person who stood in front of Gu Huayu. The mother-in-law was freed and looked at Gu Huayu with fear. Gu Huayu didn't know when a silver needle appeared in her hand. The mother-in-law couldn't help but shuddered after looking at it. Lu Fujun patted the gavel tree and asked, who is the name of the person who came down from the hall, and where does he live? The old woman was frightened by the sound of the gavel, and she leaned over and replied, Sir, I am a slave from the residence of Mr. Wang, the Minister of Rights. My surname is Gao, and everyone calls me Mrs. Gao. Lu Fuyan was stunned for a moment, unable to believe his ears, and asked again, which family do you belong to? The mother-in-law replied tremblingly, I am a servant in the residence of Mr. Wang, the Minister of Rights. My name is Gao Si, and everyone calls me Gao Poze. The officer's heart sank. He pointed at Wang Suimei and asked, you are from Wang Shilang's house. What about this one? Who is she? Mrs. Gao replied, Sir, this is my servant's daughter, Wang Suimei, the only legitimate daughter of the Wang family. The legitimate lady of the Wang mansion, isn't that the granddaughter of Marquis Yong'an? Lu Fuyan and Marquis Yong'an are brothers-in-law, and both of them married the daughter of Luo Saiking of Qianguang Temple. Lu Fuyan stood up and walked around the desk, quickly walked to Wang Suimei's side, squatted down and pushed the messy hair away from Wang Suimei's face. When he saw clearly that the person was Wang Suimei, he hurriedly raised his head and shouted, come here, call the doctor. The high-ranking official hurriedly sent for the doctor, and also called two stout women to carry Wang Suimei to the back room. After a while of busy work, Lu Fuyan called Gao Tuiguan aside. After the two of them whispered, Gao Tuiguan came towards Gu Huayu. When Lu Fuyan stood up and walked towards Wang Suimei, Gu Huayu quickly exchanged glances with Sui-Er. Sui-Er took 2 steps towards Gu Huayu and whispered, Princess, what should we do? Gu Huayu said, nothing, just watch and act according to the opportunity. Sui-Er nodded and stood beside Gu Huayu with his hands down. No more talking. After the high official arranged for someone to go to the Ministry of Etiquette to ask for Wang Shilang, he turned around and walked to Gu Huayu and said, Princess, can we take a moment to talk? Gu Huayu nodded politely, okay, Sir Gao, please. Seeing that Gu Huayu was easy to talk to, the high-ranking official felt slightly relieved and said, Princess, please come this way. Gu Huayu followed Gao Tuiguan to the reception room of the Yamen. After entering the room, Gu Huayu first asked, what do you want to say, Mr. Gao? Please tell me. The high-ranking official smiled and asked, Princess, is there a misunderstanding about this matter today? Gu Huayu looked frustrated, I can't answer this question, Mr. Gao. My shop was destroyed by Miss Wang's people, as all the neighbors on Daowen Street can testify. It is also true that my second sister was beaten by Ms. Wang's men and could not get out of bed. I specially sent Miss Wang and her entourage here, hoping that you will provide me with justice. Now it seems that Miss Wang has a close relationship with Lu Fuyan. I can no longer place my hope on Mr. Lu. I'd better go to the palace tomorrow. That's it for today, I'm going back first. Seeing that Gu Huayu was about to leave, Gao Tuiguan hurriedly tried to dissuade her. Princess, please sit down for a moment. Mr. Lu also wants to say a few words to Princess. Gu Huayu looked outside the house and said, Master Fuyan is asking Mrs. Gao now, right? Anyone with a discerning eye can see that Master Fuyan is familiar with the Wang family. Master Fuyan already has a different mind, and it is not appropriate to ask questions anymore. He should avoid suspicion and avoid it. Gao Tuiguan smiled apologetically and said, the princess is right, the fault of today's matter lies with the Wang mansion. Princess, please sit down for a while, Your Excellency will definitely give the princess an explanation. Gu Huayu heard the high-ranking official make a conclusion on this matter, and already knew that Lu Fuyan wanted to reduce the big issue to the small one, and the small matter was reduced to a small one. Since Mr. Gao said so, I will wait. In the next room, after Mrs. Gao retreated, Lu Fuyan asked, has Shilang Wang arrived? The subordinate leaned forward and said, Sir, not yet. Lu Fuyan waved his hand and said, go to the door and have a look. If Wang Shilang comes, bring Wang Shilang here directly. Subordinates bowed and stepped back. Lu Fuyan's entourage came in with the doctor. Sir, the doctor is here. Lu Fuyan raised his hands to the doctor and asked, how is it? Is the injury serious? The doctor leaned over and said, Sir, the injury is a bit serious. One leg is broken and 3 ribs are broken. I have already treated the injury and prescribed a prescription. The young lady will need to stay in bed for half a year. Lu Fuyan took a deep breath after hearing this. After thanking him, he asked his entourage to the doctor out. After the doctor left, Lu Fuyan breathed out heavily and walked around in the room. After a while, footsteps sounded outside the door. Lu Fuyan turned to look at the door. At the same time as the knock on the door, his subordinates brought Wang Shilang in and asked, Yuan Zhong, Sui is injured. Where is he? Yuan Zhong is the character of Lu Fuyan. Lu Fuyan walked over, cupped his hands towards Minister Wang, and said, Uncle Tong, don't be impatient. Sit down and listen to me slowly. Tongshu is Wang Denkei's character. Wang Shilang followed Lu Fuyan to the living room and sat down. After his subordinates served tea, Lu Fuyan sent him away. Wang Shilang asked, Yuan Zhong, Sui is in trouble again. Lu Fuyan nodded and said, this matter is a bit tricky today, so I asked someone to invite you to come over and discuss it. The thing is like this, today Sui brought more than 10 women to Huayu on Daowen Street. Go and cause trouble. Wang Shilang frowned slightly and asked, what is this Huayu pavilion selling? Lu Fuyan said, the one who sells rouge and gouache. Sui took someone to cause trouble at the rouge and gouache shop, was she injured, and then she was sued to you? Lu Fuyan nodded and sighed, it's not Sui who is here to complain, it's Princess Yan Ran who is here to complain. Princess Yan Ran opened that rouge shop. Sui is at fault for this matter. So I let you come over and see how to deal with this matter. Just now I asked Mrs. Jin next to Sui and asked her why Sui went to the shop to cause trouble. Mrs. Jin said that 3 months ago, Sui learned from somewhere that Huang Xingyi often visited Huayu Pavilion and flirted with a woman from Huayu Pavilion. This woman is the second sister of the Gu family and Princess Yan Ran. Sui wanted to come to find fault with second Miss Gu at that time, but Miss Gu returned to Shishan and left it alone. Mrs. Jin thought the matter was over. Unexpectedly, Sui heard from someone yesterday that the second Miss Gu was back. Today, she led people to find trouble for the second Miss Gu. She injured the second Miss Gu and smashed the Huayu Pavilion. End of this chapter. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every Chapter 300. Chapter 300 Sincerity. Lu Fuyan continued, this child Swimei is said to have a solid eye. You tell her, why can't she choose a better reason to cause trouble? The other party is selling things, and you find that the goods are short of goods, or the goods sold are shoddy. Why do you have to honestly say that someone seduces men? Let's leave aside whether Miss Gu Er and Huang Xingyi have an affair. Swimei, a girl who has not yet left the court, brought people to make trouble here in a big way. It would be bad for her reputation to spread. Furthermore, how can we judge the affair between a man and a woman based on the look of his eyes? To catch a thief, you need to catch the dirty part, and to catch an adulterer, you need to catch both. The more Lu Fuyan talked, the more anxious he became, his hands dancing in the air. Wang Shilang sighed and said, this child Swimei was spoiled rotten by her grandmother. Lu Fuyan also knew the situation of the Wang family. He sighed and said, Swimei is the only girl in your family, so it is inevitable that she will be pampered. However, Uncle Tong, the emperor always attaches great importance to governors. Look at how severe the punishment the emperor imposed on the British government after the incident occurred in the first half of the year. After the incident in the British government, the emperor took family tradition and education even more seriously. You are in the Ministry of Rights, so you should know more about etiquette than I do. Wang Shilang nodded, yes, this year's government affairs assessment for officials includes the addition of family management. Although the proportion is not large, it is enough to show that the emperor attaches great importance to it. Lu Fuyan nodded, Swimei's injuries are unclear. The doctor just said that she has a broken leg and 3 broken ribs. She will be bedridden for at least half a year. After hearing this, Minister Wang clenched his hands tightly in front of him, his face turned livid, and heartache showed in his eyes. Lu Fuyan and Wang Shilang have been old friends for many years. He saw Wang Shilang's mood at a glance and comforted him, we will suffer this loss, and it will teach Swimei a lesson. Wang Shilang was silent for a while, then nodded heavily and said, yes, just take it as a lesson. There was a knock on the door, and Lu Fuyan raised his voice, come in. The high official pushed the door and came in. Seeing that Wang Shilang was also there, he bowed to Wang Shilang and then said to Lu Fuyan, Your Excellency, Princess Yan Ran is clamoring to leave. She also said that she wants to go into the palace to see the emperor. Let the emperor give her justice. When Wang Shilang heard about his granddaughter's injury, he felt a lot of resentment towards Gu Huayu. Now after hearing Gao Tuiguan's words, the resentment that arose in his heart was immediately suppressed. At this moment, Hua Yanran must be persuaded, and she cannot be allowed to enter the palace to complain to the emperor. Wang Shilang stood up and said, Where is Princess Yanran? I will go and apologize to her. Lu Fuyan said, Uncle Tong, your apology is a bit harsh. Come with me. Let's go together to make amends to the princess and compensate her for the losses she suffered. Wang Shilang nodded in agreement and said, Thank you Yuan Zhong, thank you for your work. Gu Huayu was bored and was about to leave when the high official came in with Lu Fuyan and a man in his 60s. Judging from his official uniform, his official position should be quite high. Lu Fuyan entered the room with a smile and cupped his hands towards Gu Huayu and said, I'm sorry for keeping the princess waiting for so long. Gu Huayu's eyes wandered between the high official, Lu Fuyan, and the old man. Seeing that all 3 of them were smiling, she also lowered the corner of her mouth and returned the favor. Lu Fuyan turned sideways and introduced to Gu Huayu, Princess, this is Wang Swimei's grandfather, Wang Shilang of the Ministry of Rights. Wang Shilang went up to the court and cupped his hands with Gu Huayu and said, Hello, Princess. Wang Dengke, after receiving the letter from Lu Fuyan, rushed over immediately. It's all because of the lax upbringing of the little old man that this girl Swimei was allowed to act rudely in the princess's shop. The little old man apologized to the princess here. Speaking, Wang Shilang bowed deeply to Gu Huayu. Wang Shilang apologized when he came up and took all the fault on himself, which made Gu Huayu a little confused. Ever since she decided to report to the official, Gu Huayu thought about many scenarios of confrontation with the Wang family, but there was no one where the Wang family came up and apologized. The candlelight in the room lengthened the figure of Wang Shilang. Gu Huayu looked at the stooped old man in front of her, and suddenly felt very uncomfortable. Wang Shilang straightened up and continued, "My granddaughter is in a state of disgrace. I will definitely discipline her strictly when I go back. I also ask the princess to give this girl Swimei a chance to change her ways for the sake of the little old man. Of course, the old man will compensate for the damage caused to the princess's shop according to the price." Seeing his sincerity, Gu Huayu softened her heart and said, "Shilang Wang is sincere. If I hold on to him, I will be unreasonable and unforgiving. However, in order to avoid entanglements in the future, even if it is private, we must have a private charter." As soon as Gu Huayu's words came out, everyone in the room was stunned. Lu Fuyan's eyes darkened, and he looked at Gu Huayu with a deeper look. Gu Huayu is young and his cautious and sophisticated attitude surprised him. At the same time, he was grateful for his decision. It is said that Princess Yan Ran grew up in the mountains and was uneducated and ignorant of etiquette. She was just an embroidered pillow. Today, he almost despised this princess who had a bad reputation. His perception of her changed when he saw her standing in court and calmly stating the case. Years of experience in handling cases told him that the little girl in front of him was not simple. Lu Fuyan suddenly remembered the case between Giung and Banrixian in the east of the city. The person who made Kui Mingqing, Zhangji, and Muzexin fall into a fight was Hua Yan Ran. Lu Fuyan immediately became cautious, so when he learned that the person causing trouble was that girl Swimei, he did not force himself to stand up for Swimei, but went to find Wang Shilang to handle the matter. The high-ranking official blurted out and asked, "Articles of association? May I ask, Princess, what articles of association? Since it is private, where are the regulations?" Gu Huayu looked at the high-ranking official and said, "Wang Shilang admitted that what happened today was his granddaughter Wang Swimei's fault. He said that when he goes back, he will strictly discipline Wang Swimei and compensate for the damage to my shop." "Yes." Bar. Gao Tuiguan nodded. As an official of the imperial court, Wang Shilang naturally means what he says. Gu Huayu said, "But it's empty talk, why should I believe it?" Naturally, Wang Shilang was unwilling to leave the words in Gu Huayu's hands, so he said, "I understand the princess's worries. Let's do the math. The princess will calculate how much the princess's shop has lost, and the little old man will immediately compensate the princess." This is what Gu Huayu was waiting for. She didn't want to send someone out several times just for some money. Gu Huayu took out the list prepared in advance from her purse and handed it over. "I will list all the compensation items here. Minister Wang, please take a look." Wang Shilang took the list, glanced at the beginning, and his eyes immediately fell on the amount at the back. After he saw the amount clearly, he looked up at Gu Huayu in shock. "Princess, 6,500 taels of silver? Did you calculate it wrong?" Wang Shilang spoke implicitly and did not directly say that Hua Yan Ran was blackmailing. Lu Fuyan and Gao Tuiguan heard this and looked over. The high official asked, "Princess, what happened today is Miss Wang's fault. But Wang Shilang sincerely apologized to you, and we also hope that the princess can show sincerity." Gu Huayu took the list out of Wang Shilang's hand, held it up in his hand, and said, "Do you think I took the opportunity to blackmail you? I'm really prepared to try to do it today." As she spoke, Gu Huayu took out another list from her purse. "Before coming to the Yamen, I prepared 2 lists. It depends on the situation. If Wang's attitude is good, even if you just gave you this one, everything will be compensated according to the price. If you have a bad attitude, it's this piece, and I'll pay 3 times the original price as compensation." If you dare not pay, I'll go to the palace and ask the emperor to make a decision for me. After taking Gu Huayu, the high promotion officer took out the list and saw that the numbers in the front were the same, but there was an additional compensation clause in the back that affected the reputation of the shop and caused losses, and the compensation was 5,000 taels. There is also Wang Suimei who slandered Miss Gu Er and was charged 10,000 taels for mental damages. This blatant person wants money, and you have nothing to say to him. Gao Tuiguan, Lu Fuyan, and Wang Shilang looked at each other in confusion. Gu Huayu continued, you can go and ask around. The fragrant dew in my shop is all refined from precious spices. Taking the Nuaniang fragrance as an example, it is refined and formulated with more than 10 kinds of precious spices. Let's not talk about the uncommon ones, let's talk about the common sandalwood. It takes 50 kilograms of sandalwood to carry 2 kilograms of essential oil. How much does 1 kilogram of sandalwood cost? After all this, do you still think I am extorting money? Wanja costs 68 taels of silver per bottle, and Nuaniang costs 92 cents of silver per bottle. Miss Wang led others to smash 30 bottles of Wanju, which is 2,176 taels. 42 bottles of Nuaniang, another 3,780 taels. In addition, there are 15 bottles of liquid foundation, 75 taels, and 12 boxes of rouge, 36 taels of silver. The total of these is 6,067 taels of silver. In addition to the tables, chairs, and shelves in the shop, plus my second sister's medical expenses, I charge you 6,500 taels of silver. I don't ask for a penny more. Wang Shilang nodded painfully and said, okay, just follow what the princess said. I will ask someone to get the banknotes right now. After speaking, Wang Shilang said to Gao Tuiguan, Master Gao, let my entourage come in. The high official turned around and went out to call in Wang Shilang's entourage. Wang Shilang explained to him, and then he left. Seeing that the two parties had reached an agreement, Lu Fuyan smiled and smoothed things over, come on, let's sit here, don't stand. Wang Shilang bowed to Gu Huayu and said, Princess, please. Gu Huayu returned the courtesy and asked Wang Shilang to come forward. Shilang Wang is the elder, please ask Shilang Wang. Lu Fuyan smiled and said, Princess, according to etiquette, you should respect the humble first, then the elder. The princess has a distinguished status, so the princess should go first. Gu Huayu saw that she could not evade, so she had no choice but to go ahead. Everyone sat down, drank tea and talked. Lu Fuyan took care of Gu Huayu's feelings and talked about the customs of the Jiangnan area, gossip that Gu Huayu could understand and follow. After chatting for a while, Wang Shilang's entourage came back with the banknotes. After Wang Shilang ordered it once, he stood up and leaned over and handed it to Gu Huayu. Princess, please click, the total is 6,500 taels. Gu Huayu stood up, took the banknote, and put it away directly. Shilang Wang has already ordered it, so I don't need to order it again. Lu Fuyan smiled and smoothed things over and said, although we all know each other in this way, through this matter, I have seen the princess's crispness and the responsibility of Wang Shilang. Both of you, I admire. Wang Shilang smiled and cupped his hands and said, my uncle's words of responsibility make me feel ashamed. In just over an hour of getting along with the princess, I can see the difference. The princess is younger than Suimei, but her behavior and dealings with others are much more mature and steady than that girl Suimei. This little money was well spent today. Gu Huayu felt a little uncomfortable being praised by Wang Shilang. She has always been a soft-spoken person. If Wang Shilang and Lu Fuyan were to fight against her, she would be able to fight them to the end. The more courteously they treated each other like gentlemen, the more uncomfortable she became, and she even felt that she was not worthy of the money she deserved. Gu Huayu said with embarrassment, Master Lu, Minister Wang has thanked you. I was also impulsive about today's matter, and I was a little harsh on Miss Wang. There are some pills in the house that can help with bone repair. I'll give it to you tomorrow. Have someone send some to Wang's house. Wang Shilang bowed and thanked her. The princess is very considerate. I will thank the princess on Swimay's behalf. Gu Huayu nodded, stood up and said goodbye, then I'll go back first. Lu Fuyan and Wang Shilang stood up and sent Gu Huayu to the gate. They watched Gu Huayu's car go away before turning around and walking back. Wang Shilang said to Lu Fuyan, Uncle Tong, thank you very much for what happened today. Lu Fuyan shook his head and said, Swimei is also my great niece, so I should help her. Although Swimei is usually more willful, she also knows the importance of things. How could she do such a stupid thing today? Wang Shilang shook his head and said, I'm also confused about this matter. I'll ask more carefully when I get back. Lu Fuyan nodded, let's wait a few days before asking. I think Swimei's injury is not going to be easy in the next few days, and she will suffer for a few days. Wang Shilang said, it is also a good thing to let her suffer some physical pain. After this experience, she will have a long memory and will not dare to do anything wrong again in the future. That's right, children always have to go through some things before they become sensible. Go back and ask Swimei what's going on, and don't take the wrong advice. Wang Shilang thought of Hua Yanran and then his granddaughter, and sighed slightly, thanks, I will. It's getting late, I'll go back first. Which room is Swimei in? I'll take her back. The high-ranking official leaned forward and said, I've already sent someone to send Miss Wang back to her home. And Wang Shilang thanked him, turned around and got into the carriage. As Gu Huayu boarded the car, King Qin reached out to help her and whispered, slow down. Gu Huayu was a little surprised when she saw King Qin, but more satisfied and happy. Gu Huayu sat down and opened the curtains to say goodbye to Lu Fuyan and Wang Shilang, and King Yu drove away. After the carriage had traveled for a while, King Qin asked, is everything going well? Gu Huayu leaned into King Qin's arms, nodded and said, well, Mr. Wang is very sensible. He didn't blame me for attacking Wang Swimei and even compensated for the loss of the shop. Is Mr. Wang very poor? Are you familiar with Mr. Wang? King Qin shook his head and said, I'm not familiar with it. When my grandfather was the Minister of Rights, I occasionally heard Wang Denkei's name once or twice. Maybe it was to avoid suspicion. Wang Shilang hardly went to my grandfather's house, so I don't know much about the affairs of Wang's house. What happened today, so I asked Rugjuan to check on the Wang family. Inquiring about the news, Wang Shilang was from Xianan and came from a poor family. He was a Jinchi during the reign of the late emperor. He passed the Jinchi examination and then became a Shujishi. He served in the Hanlin Academy for several years and then entered the Ministry of Rights. End of this chapter.